This thrilling manhwa combo was brought to you by Miss Mysterious and contains intense romance, fiery passions, and tantalizing plots. This is a unique manhwa recapping as it has not one, but two manhwa stories in one. Just for you. I hope you enjoy. This manhwa starts off with the main character's name called Irene, and it is set in the royal land of Caldona. A guy with hair as white as pure icy snow addressed the young maiden by name and leaned over. She called out to the guy and called him Your Majesty. She knew that servants were never supposed to show emotion, right hands by remove. He wanted her to tell that she would mind. They both knew that. Servants were the property of the imperial family and they have to remember that. An incredible imperial palace called Caldona, with huge grounds, an impressive view. A few years ago, Irene was addressed by name and someone asked if she had picked up a dress. The woman wanted to throw petals into the bathtub and decided to ask the protagonists which ones to throw. The woman said that the threat seemed strange to her. Iran had already taken the dress and asked the heroine to leave a box with the jewelry. The protagonist advised that the petals should be dried immediately because they would give off a strong, pungent odor. It occurs to the girl that the experience of having a bunch of brothers and sisters was very useful for the sentence. The girl was called out and warned about the threat. Irene round to sort it out. The heroine is plunged into memories of father died in the war and her mother was seriously ill because of these events. She had to feed her entire family by herself. She remembers how hard it was for them to survive on the small village wages. After these events, Irene jumped at the chance to become a servant at the imperial court. The girl already has 2 months worked as a servant in a space. She was satisfied with the salary and life in the capital. The protagonist was not difficult to work because she served the princess. Lauren Veronica was the princess of the empire and turned to Irene to thank her and note how quickly she was handling everything. Irene was the princess of Savior. Veronica had no idea what she would do without the girl. I didn't understand how to react to such compliments and replied that Her Majesty was flattering her. The main character wanted to take Veronica to the banquet and the princess didn't at all. On this day Lauren, second brother, was returning with this news chief dumbfounded. Her servant for Irene had not seen him until now. The princess's brother was the second principal or an empire. He was the captain of the Order of Knights. The young man had a high status, but there were rumors of his rough character. Aaron hoped in her thoughts. But the prince would not quarrel with his father because there's to be a banquet in honor of the emperor. The princess stepped and felt a sharp pain in her feet. Irene was nearby and was surprised by this. Lauren had a size 230 foot, but they had brought her a size 220 shoe and the shoes were too small for her. Didn't know what to do with the bank. Was about to start in 5 minutes. Irene asked if mistresses butchered a lot, but feet were hurting so much that mistress couldn't walk. The protagonist lowered her gaze and it stopped her shoes. Imperial servants wore low-heeled black shoes. Her mother had made these shoes for Iran to make up for what she's been through in her life because of her family. Mom was apologizing for not being able to help Irene get into academy, which was I'm not. When she gave these shoes to her daughter, she told her to take care of herself and not to worry about anything. I really didn't want to spoil her mother's gift, so she didn't wear them a dozen times. The girls had size, and Irene suggested her mistress to wear her shoes. They were sure to fit the princess' feet. Lauren put those shoes on while they searched for the right shoes for her. Iran asked another mate, Lisa, to escort Lauren until she returned. The tired protagonist sat down on the bench. The maidservant was lucky her shoes were not visible behind her mistress's dress and avoided any problems that may. You could finally exhale and relax. Irene had been walking around back, but the whole time they had taken a good beating. She knew what she would get him dirty. She didn't want to ruin her. Moms get a young boy sat down on the bench next to the girl they met. Eyes. Their eyes merged into one and formed a single entity. Irene didn't know who. The young man. The girl stared at the guy and he asked. What exactly was she doing there? The guy was having a bad day and all these thoughts were preoccupied with just that. The girl thought about leaving. She was intimidated by this guy, but she smelled the scent of forgetting off that she didn't realize it. That was coming from him. Irene was wrapped up in a thought of how handsome he was. The young man noticed the girl's bare legs and concluded that she had some strange hobbies. The girl could not tell him the real reason for her uncovered legs were servants must keep their mouths shut at all times, no matter who stood before them. Any word of Iran's could hurt her mistress. The man saw the girl's legs were covered with bruises and he asked her if she was hurt. She didn't understand what he wanted. I still didn't understand why his telling it has so indent. But she couldn't sit like this and it was better to leave even though she was ashamed. The main character screamed when they got that. He thought he scared her, but she just wanted him to leave. The man sat down in front of her, and her eyes met again. He asked that she holds out her feet. Concerned towards Irene and began to wipe out white, something no one had ever taken care of. At this time, he advised her to be sure to treat her wounds. Irene wasn't used to this, but she thanked the Lord and watched him leave. And here's how events unfolded 3 years later. A young girl was looking for the chapter and looked into the room in an effort to find it. Make no mistake about the door and the chapter was in the room. She allowed her to enter. The girl had incredible folks into the princess already an accomplishment, but to be promoted to head servant in the palace was simply unthinkable. The girl came to report for the crown prince's suit had arrived. The head was surprised at how quickly it had arrived, but her thoughts were interrupted by the maid's question about her next actions. Today the prince had a meeting before the dinner party and the soup had to be taken to his office. That's where he usually changed. They had to hurry while there was still time. Nice-looking guy named even Veronica, but he was the crown prince. He thought the dinner party was going to be a problem, but now he's got another meeting on his hands. Everyone thought Ivan was extremely trustworthy. The emperor trusted him. That's why he trusted him with his job. Ira knew the more robotic Ivan was, the more robotic she was as well. A lone tear streamed down the girl's face. A year ago when she worked for the princess, things have been much simpler. The whole country was moving at the same pace and she did more behind. A guy in a blue suit entered the office and addressed the prince. He announced that His Majesty Theo would be arriving today. Leo was the second prince, the very captain of the Order of Knights. Even was surprised at this news events that unfolded in Verona 3 years ago. At that time, the Empire Verona was under attack by barbarians supported by the Silver Eni Empire. The stronghold of the war was a border fortress and its soldiers had a hard time. And even the second prince himself, the head of the entire army, had to enter the battle. The duration of the war was 9 months. Even the aristocrats joined the battle. The empire was able to survive because of their combined efforts. During the war, the second prince was seriously injured. He was immediately sent to the temple. Because of this, he had not been seen for 2 years and he was happy about that fact. The rumors said that his wounds were very serious, there was just incredibly strong. Because of this factor, he became the captain of the Order of Knights. The maid came in and announced that everything was ready for you, announced that the girl had done a great job and had gotten everything done quite quickly. It was not expected. Her Iran thanked him and left. The emperor was happy to see Evan. It was unexpected for him. Lauren suddenly saw Iran and was overjoyed. She rushed to her and thought that her brother was torturing Irene cause the girl was very thin. Lauren wanted her to come back to her, but her brother objected. He didn't see the point in having the head of his servants return to his sister. The girl thanked him for the offer, but the man was paying. How much? More than more. And it was about Theo. They were all forgetting together that day. Lauren wondered if her brother was well. The emperor said that they had been fined for 3 months. The princess asked why he hadn't come back. She was shocked. Leo had been practicing every single day with the knights to get back in shape. The man didn't understand Theo, even though he was his son. Lauren concluded that they would have that pile of muscle back again. Irene smelled a familiar sentence. Sophia vehicles his sister mean for discussing her brother so brazenly. Lauren took him rage. Why would she be mean? We only need in response. They said a friendly hello to Even and they shook hands. Lauren didn't even shake his hand. The envoy asked his son if he was really healthy. They answered the clear yes and it's all thanks to your support. Via fell down and even joked that was 90 etiquette. Irene looked at the guy. We realized it was him. The same guy who had suddenly spoken to her and helped her 3 years ago. It was then that the guy had given her a helping hand for free. Irene prayed for his life every day that they would meet again. The girl noticed a change in the guy. Before he had all black hair and now he was post-blonde in front of that. But he was still the same. The same face and the same figure and even the same center forget-me-nots as 3 years ago. Irene still couldn't believe it was him. She wondered if it could be someone similar. The two girls discussed that the other prince had been sent to a magic healer to kill him. Irene understood magic had a way of changing hair color. The puzzle in her head was now complete. She was sure it was him. A tired girl came to her room and lay down on the bed. She was already agitated even though the prince had just returned to the palace. Irene got up from the bed and went under that. She took out a golden box that contained black bandages with blue pattern. The same bandages two princes had used to wrap your legs during their first meeting. Everyone guessed, but the guy was a nobleman, but she had no idea that he was the second prince of the empire. It was a beautiful sunny day. Outside the window, everything was in bloom. Irene was summoned to her room by His Majesty. Even the girl arrived just in time. There was a costume for the empire's longevity ceremony on the couch, but it was too big and Even and Thea's costumes were mixed up. Even asked the main character to go check it out. The girl's thin brush approached Mr. Theodore. Iran not then stepped inside. The servant announced that she had come on an errand for Mr. Evan. But there was no one in the study. She was glad that fact. She saw the suit lying on the couch. It was the one she needed to check out. It was obvious to the naked eye that the suits were mixed up. Irene couldn't help but pick up His Majesty Fear's shirt. After all, he was the first one to take care of the girl. She's more to herself that her heart would never weaver. Mr. Theo had been away from the palace for 2 whole years and his wounds were truly terrible. The girl brought the shirt, her nose, and inhaled the fragrance of the forget-me-nots. This excellent fragrance was entirely Theo's. The maid hopes that no one saw this, but from the side Mr. Theo was watching her. He stood in the room and watched the whole time as I rented the shirt and pressed it to her face. A shiver went down her body. At the realization that he had seen everything, she apologized to the second prince. And equated her actual mortal sin. After saying that she had to run and she was out of Fear's sight, Irene quickly ran out of Mr. Fear's office and thought about how crazy she was. The girl didn't know what she was thinking. When she did this act, she was sure that it surprised the Lord terribly. She will be very lucky at the second prince forgot about this situation. The girl calmed down and wants to take the suit to Mr. Evan, but she forgot to take. She realized that the suit would not come to her on its own and went to get herself. She didn't need to run away from reality. She needed to undo everything I read. Not something historian. He allowed her to enter. She explained to the second prince that she came from Mr. Avon and he was the one who sent her that because their costumes were mixed up. She didn't want to stop Theo, so she just took the costume and wanted to leave. The protagonist turned around and saw that all-masculine figure of Mr. Theo in front of her. The second prince inquired as to whether he met for the boy, stared at the girl and she returned the favor. Do you wonder what Irene was doing with his shirt and why she had taken it so? The Oscar about it. Irene didn't understand how could be explained. She was sure that the other prince thought she was some kind of pervert. They asked the girl's name, in response to which she was surprised. He didn't understand her reaction. After all, you've just asked the name, I unfold. But the gentleman was finding out her name in order to downgrade. Or worse. It was all Irene's fault. The servants had only one purpose above all others. They were never allowed to cross their master, who had a thought. Maybe she wants to hurt his brother. That's why she was wearing his shirt. The Lords of the Badger, 3 stars on Iran's chest. They said that she held a high position in the palace. They want more than it doesn't like her any empire. The protagonist thought that he wasn't knowledgeable on the subject. Iran did not answer the master's question and he asked her name again. She timidly mouthed her name. She felt that something was wrong and had a bad feeling. Theo, wearing a black shirt and a blue vest, entered the office and said hello to Mr. Ivan and Irene. Irene, for it was strange that the guy came in so often. The second friends. Last I ran to leave her and her brother alone. They needed to socialize. She obediently left the study and disappeared behind the door. They all had a request for his brother. He wanted Even to give Iran to him. Mr. Theo liked the girl during the first week of their acquaintance. That's why he wanted Even to give her to him. Irene was hard to pry out of Mr. Evans' affairs. I wonder why Theo needed her specifically since there were other high-ranking servants. Irene used to be Lauren's servant and Even took her in and promoted her to head servant. The 3 of them needed her, and that was why the prince had told his brother. Even finally agreed to give the main character to Theo, but on the condition that he would not bring her to resignation. If he did not do it, the second friends would go to the emperor and tell him everything. Regardless of how Lauren behaved, everyone knew Theo was not strong. Even could have called a priest to perform ceremony again, but they wouldn't listen to him, turning around and preferring to get out of sight. Even reflected on the fact that Theo was completely unlike himself, following God's will. He was supposed to live to the age of 23 and it was irreversible, but it had been 10 years since little Theo and his father had been told that 23 Theo was 3 years ago, and it was 3 years ago that the war with It's already began. At the time, everyone had reason, but the second prince would die in the war. But all ended well. The prince remembered that he had to ask Iran to go over to Theo, and he realized that he had better keep an eye on them. Irene was not left with thoughts of Mr. Theo. She was willing to do anything to make the second prince forget her. Mr. Theo approached Irene from behind and leaned in close to her ear so that she could feel his hot breath. The girl didn't expect it and immediately bounced away from the guy, the second prince, or to frighten the girl's eyes and parallels with the fact that she had sensed somewhere. Irene asked what the conversation was about. They replied that she would soon understand. They'll remember their last meeting, and placed his hand on the glass next to the ready girl. He offered her something more meaning himself, but the girl timidly refused. At that moment he put his index finger to the girl's list. The second friends directly offered Iran to spend the night with him and sleep with him. The girl covered her ears in response to this offer because she didn't want to hear it. But the prince didn't understand this reaction, for the girl had everything anyway. I wouldn't understand why the prince saying this to her. The protagonist could not contain her emotions and accidentally yelled at his majesty. There was a huge gulf between them and their mother. How much Iran didn't want it. She couldn't let it happen because she was a servant and he was a lord, and the difference between the state chooses couldn't be ignored. Because of this, the girl tried to bury her feelings for Theo. The main character wanted to remain a loyal servant of Mr. Avenue in order not to interfere with Theo, but the second prince for some reason still paid attention to the girl. Irene was standing in front of Theo before she heard the next question. He wanted to ask why she was acting like that, since for some reason she was pressing his shirt against his face. The girl couldn't give an answer to that question, so she asked a counter-question. She wants to know why Theo was treating her like that. The protagonist couldn't ignore the attention of the man she liked, but it wasn't supposed to be like this. He wasn't supposed to say we have things to her and ask her to sleep with him. I really liked her master, which is why he offered her such things. After all, that was the reason why people slept with each other. She asked the other prince what exactly H immediately pointed to the beautiful girl's face with his words. She was surprised to hear such an answer. This is not enough for the girl, but the guy thought the opposite. They didn't know each other at all and could only judge each other by their appearance. Irene had never really thought about it, but she realized that the guy was right. The two of them knew nothing about each other, and were no different in that respect. Video told the girl to think about it and tapped his finger on her forehead. The guy finished his conversation and said that he would leave the rest of Iran to think about, and then he was out of sight. The news reached the two servants of the palace that Mr. Theo's new personal servant would be the head of the servants, and they excitedly began to discuss it among themselves. Iran came to Mr. Van and began to beg him to stay on as his servant, even judged by his experience, and realized that there was nothing to be done about it and he could not change his brother's decision. There was not particularly fastidious, so the head of the major not worry about it. But the main character was not worried about that at all. She was worried about the fact that they wanted to sleep with her. The girl with the short haircut said that they already had two servants. So Iran didn't have much work to do. The protagonists didn't understand why they needed her then, since he already had two servants. These thoughts frightened her, but she still couldn't do anything about it and she just had to do her job well. A girl was cleaning the office of the second prince. He approached her from behind and asked her in a whisper as she had thought about their previous conversation. The girl didn't expect to see him behind her back and bounced away. I don't have been mentally preparing for this question, but she wasn't prepared for it to happen so quickly. Villa wanted a clear answer to his question, so he pressured the girl even more. Irene liked the other prince, so she just couldn't refuse him and she had to avoid answering. It was hard for her to have feelings for such a person. Theo took her hand and pressed her body closer. The girl looked at the prince in bewilderment, and the boy looked at her like a small, defenseless kitten. Mr. Theo took the maid by the head and fell into her honey sweet list. Feeling their taste, the girl pushed her lord away hard and he grinned at her reaction. And then Aaron realized that from the very beginning the second prince was just mocking her. Irene was aggressively filling out a stack of paperwork and thinking about how it was very hard to resist temptation and wanted to say no the next time Mr. Theo offers something in a place every person would be surprised if the object of their affection offered to sleep with her. That for the girl at ease, the protagonist found a document that was written in the ancient language all commands. It was not the first time the girl saw this language. Previously she had encountered it when she was preparing to enter the college. All maps had not been used for a long time. She put the papers in a brown folder with black fittings, but they were going to be burned. The girl's head was filled with only one thought. How much you get the attention of a second prince away from her. At this rate, she felt her heart would stop. A girl with black hair ran up to the head servant. It was Summer. They had worked together when Irene worked as Lauren's servant. It had been a long time since they had seen each other. The main character asked how the princess was doing, and at that moment she realized that Mistress Lauren would be able to help her. The princess was happy to see her former servant as they hadn't seen each other for quite some time. At that moment, Irene had that 10 minutes to convince Lauren to take her back as a servant. The time was so short because Mr. Theo had left for a meeting 20 minutes ago and could return at any moment. Mrs. Lauren understood that the girl had come to her for a reason and wanted to talk about something. The princess was willing to listen to the girl. Lauren didn't know that Irene was now Theo's servant and started asking how she was serving at Mr. Stevens' place because he had a lot of things to do. The princess' ignorance made things difficult for Irene, but she still stopped thinking that she was now Mr. Theo, servant, and knew. Unforeseen circumstances His Majesty have replaced one servant with Irene. Princess Lauren was furious at her brother's behavior. Her Majesty wanted to know why Theo wanted Irene, so she asked the girl herself. The girl pretended not to know or understand. She had a lot of problems and more info, but few had caused those problems. Irene couldn't confirm or deny that, so she smiled gently at the place of the answer. The princess stormed out of a seat and went to the office to talk to him. I would try to best to stop her, but it was all in vain. She didn't even want to hear anything. The protagonist did not want to arrange a quarrel between brother and sister, but there was no way to influence it. Lauren went into her brother's room and saw that he was not there alone, but with his assistant. Didn't expect to see the girls. Lauren slapped a hand on the table and said they needed to talk urgently. Irene stood next to her and wanted to fall through the ground. She realized what she had done. She had known it would go this far. She wouldn't have started this conversation. Irene stalled the Princess Lauren's side, although she should have been by her master Theo's side. The girl wanted to go to Theater's side, but Lauren blocked her way with her hand and started a dialogue with her brother. She wanted to know why Theo made Iran his servant. Or rather, she wanted to know why he was making life difficult for the poor girl. They didn't understand what he was talking about because he didn't burn the main character with work and she didn't do anything super complicated, and Irene confirmed it. She was very ashamed and wanted to rewind time. Irene had made a terrible mistake that day and there was nothing she could do about it. She was very embarrassed to stand in front of Mr. Theo. It was not a problem for Irene to be with Theo, and she told him so. She obviously didn't like him or station, so she took that step. They didn't expect that he was so disgusted with Irene. He promised that he would not allow such behavior on his part again. The second friends felt guilty and apologized to the girl, after which she left. There was an obvious truth in the palace: servants who lost trust had no future. There always had to be trust in the relationship between master and servant, and the head of the servant had deliberately slandered the master in front of another person. If they had ignored her from the beginning, it would have been much better before he had at least said hello to her. But now he pretended that they didn't know each other and ignored Irene's existence. It had the goal, but she knew it was all her fault. The girl distracted ahead, made from her thoughts with the question. His Majesty Theo needed to make a suit for Lauren's birthday party and needed to get measurements from him. Recently there had been a ceremony for the Empire's longevity where Theo had been wearing an excellent suit, but the guy had said that the suit didn't fit him. Irene knocked on the large heavy door of Mr. Theo's study and entered to take his measurements. His Majesty was sitting at his desk writing some documents. The girl reported that she even sent to him to take the measurements for his sister's birthday suit. The guy stood in front of her and took off his best so the girl could take the correct measurements. The young people exchanged glances and I really felt that she was still tormented by thoughts of Theo. The servant finished her work and took all the measurements for the bold suit. Erin felt a heart beating faster. She thought it would jump out of her chest and at this rate His Majesty would realize everything. The girl is about to leave, but accidentally tripped and started to fall. At that moment she felt Mr. Theo's big and strong hand grabbed her waist. But he didn't let her fall to the floor. That I told her to be careful. The girl quickly pulled away from the guy, thanked him and wanted to leave, but they wanted to talk to her about something. Inopportune moment, because assistant in a black suit came in and Irene disappeared in the doorway. Villa was left alone with the boy, and the latter in turn asked. It was the main Theo had told him about, and yes, it was her. Is not just decide started to say something about my rain space, but abruptly interrupted his monologue and changed his mind about telling Theo. The second friends noted that they were similar to his brother in this way because they started to say something and then stopped abruptly. The guy in the black suit came to talk about the successful development of the Northlands. Marquisate was actively helping them. The presence of the second prince was not necessary. If something happened, you would be informed about it at once. The gentleman's assistant picked up a mountain of documents from which a black envelope with a gold seal fell out. The letter was Theo, but he still had not responded to it. The censors of the letter wanted to win His Majesty over to their side in any way they could capitalize on his popularity. View opens the envelope which contained a letter, but it was all written in a language the boys did not understand. Didn't understand why they were sending him so many letters if they were going to meet at the temple of the service anyway. Assistant's whose father was pastor, but Alau's his son was not, and they could not make out what the letter was about. The second prince did not understand the point of sending letters in a language that only those who wrote them could understand. It was a beautiful sunny day outside the palace window. Birds were singing and everything was in full bloom. The redhead girl said hello to the head of the servants. The servants were busy preparing for dinner. They were interested in it. Everyone was busy at that moment, but everyone was coping and Irene was involved in gathering the second prince for the celebration. The redhead girl partly understood why everyone wanted to take Iran as a servant. It was time for him to go. So she said goodbye to Irene and left to help prepare for the princess' birthday party. The second friends had a splendid blue suit with gold cuffs, fittings and fringe on the shoulders. Also 2 of the Laws of War medals on his chest. Irene needed to concentrate, but she was thinking silly things. There were 5 people in the princess' study free helping him dress, and one was reading him a report. Luckily for Irene, they weren't alone in the room. He was already packed and instructed his assistant to read the report next time. And Irene was frustrated by the fact that the gentleman still wouldn't look her in the eye. They entered the hall where the ceremony was to take place. V's assistant asked him to behave himself at the event. Vi called him down and said that he would not organize anything. But he did not mean it. Basil was Mr. Theo's closest assistant, he was his closest subordinate. This is a man the master trusts completely device. They're not to drink much, and I realized that he was definitely a good man. His Majesty assured Basil that everything would be fine and asked him to back off. The second prince was tired and found agreed everyone and leave. They didn't observe assistant anywhere and wanted to know where she was. Already been meaning to say for a long time, Lauren was near the entrance and that was where they went at that moment. The others were already like that too. If you haven't been to the palace in a long time and didn't remember how to go to some parts of it, they will help him with that. He was already waiting at the entrance and was reprimanded for being late. The princess saw Iran and joyfully approached her. Irene was mutually happy to see her, and in turn, wish her happy birthday. Lauren was grateful to the girl for coming to her celebration. Her Majesty was immediately reminded of the time when the protagonist served her. Lauren wasn't expecting to see her brother and they almost started fighting, but it was already time to start. Lauren walked past the guests and Theo noted that she was proud to the point of nausea. The princess threw her brother a judgmental look and walked on. Things are going much better than Irene had imagined. She hopes that this was how things would go from here on out. The birthday girl offered her brother a drink in honor of the celebration. The guests were discussing the fact that something was coming up, and it was an undeniable fact. The princess concluded there was not interesting to drink just like that and suggested that if she won, her brother would give her Irene. The protagonist was shocked by this turn of events. Claire noted that Lauren seemed to really like Irene. The brother and sister began to argue about who would be better for Irene and she didn't understand why they were betting cause whoever took her didn't have a choice. They started the vet and Theo had the first drink and said that if he won, Lauren would never bring it up again. The 2 of them agreed to the terms. Irene stood in anticipation and waited to see how it would end. There were bottles scattered around the table where they were drinking and the man who was drinking next to them felt bad and left the event. I really wanted to stop them, but Theo took the bottle of alcohol from the servant's hands and poured himself a drink. He was determined not to give Her Majesty the main character. And walked out from the table. There was drunk, and Irene helped into his room. The head servant thanked her staff and went to Mr. Theo. He was obviously not feeling well. The girl sat on the edge of the couch and began undressing the Lord just to help him, especially since it was duty next to him. Aaron's heart was beating very fast. It seems to be not just sympathy, but a strong crush. Aaron thought that he hated her after she betrayed him. The girl wanted to know the answer to the only question why he wasn't talking to her. She asked it to the sleeping guy, hoping he would answer. She would feel a lot better if he told her he hated her. She thought the prince had fallen asleep and could not resist the urge to kiss him. And Jenny covered Field's lips with her own. And at that moment the boy opened his eyes. Irene opened her eyes and saw that the master was awake and looking at her. Couch so that he was on top of her. He asked why she said she didn't like the kiss, why she didn't want to sleep with him but kept it up. The girl never said she didn't want to. She couldn't agree to it because of a status difference. Irene constantly avoided eye contact with Theo. Oscar just stopped doing so. There would be no more misunderstandings between them. The monster, all stiff ago, really wanted to sleep with him. Feels that he would kiss her, but she didn't answer. She could have hit him over his tongue, but she answered him with a mutual kiss and Irene realized that she really loved this guy. Irene was kissing the person she loved for the first time. He put his hand under her skirt and she realized that she had never felt like this before. She couldn't breathe. It was all very strange to her because he was drinking and she was intoxicated, but the guy was sober and his mind was clear. He wouldn't run from responsibility after this. Irene had always wanted to, but she couldn't tell Theo directly. The guy asked the protagonists not to worry and promised that he would be gentle. From him that I wanted to see all of her. Now they were getting serious. It was already morning outside the window and Irene woke up. She was confused as to how she could let this happen at night. He was her master. The girl did not spend the night in the dormitory. It could have been noticed down rumors, but it started. Irene didn't want that and was about to get out of there to leave. But the prince noticed and pulled her into his arms by noted that Irene had been drinking last night and he was already aware of everything when he got under her skirt. So they didn't have any problems. They asked the servants to bring clothes for Irene. She didn't understand why he did it after all now. Everyone could find out about their relationship. The guy asked if the girl would have breakfast or if they could do the same thing they did at night. The maid had a very sore lower back and refused. Mr. Theo Vassal was already knocking at the princess room and came in with breakfast as soon as Irene got dressed. Irene and listened to what his assistant came to report. Basil gave a second printer from the temple and the prince wasn't too happy about it. He realized he wouldn't be able to read its contents again. Irene had seen this letter before but had scrapped it last time. It was necessary to read the letter and reply to it. Letters were sent all the time and the girl concluded that only important information could be sent so many times. The language could translate the letter for the prince. The events of 10 years ago began to come to mind. There was a 13-year-old child when he and his family learned the prophecy in 10 years. The boy was to be overtaken by doubt and it was not abhorrent. I really wanted to help the boys with the translation of the letter. They were surprised that she knew this language even though she had not entered the spiritual academy. The young man with the knowledge of the ancient language, although there was from the royal family of Verona, he had never been close to religion. But absolutely all the prophecies of the high priest came true. A priest 10 years ago told a prophecy that Fear would die at the age of 23. But he is now 26 and still alive, and judging by the translation, the path of his destiny has changed. The second friends to go to the temple as the initiation ceremony would be held in just 4 days. The Ide wanted to object and tell the prince to go earlier, but Theo had enough problems. Without this prophecy, all days would not solve anything. Irene was glad she had translated the letter and was able to help in some way, but she wondered why the prophecy had changed when Irene returned to the dormitory. Another maid, Everett, asked why she didn't return yesterday. The protectionist tried to change the subject, but she failed. She started to explain to Everett that His Majesty Theo had been drinking too much last night, but her friend interrupted her and advised her to hide the kiss on her neck so the butler wouldn't find out. Now Irene had to be much more careful with Mr. CEO. Irene was pouring tea into a mug and Theo came up behind her and hugged. The girl was a little startled by the surprise. I asked her what she was going to wear to the ceremony. She said the same as she always wore. The guy took the girl by the waist and wanted to take a break. Irene was pleased with his attention. One to take good care of Theo. Iran agreed to go to the ceremony. The boy asked how the maid's lower backwards and if she needed a doctor. Her lower back was already fine at that point. Irene complimented the prince on his sentence. He smelled very pleasantly. Forget-me-nots. His eyes were as blue as that flower. They was glad that things were getting better for them. In the beginning of the assault, Irene was very cautious. That's when he started to notice her gaze directed straight at him. He always wondered why she was looking at him like that. For a while the prince could resist the green-eyed beauty's charms, but everything led to them becoming too close. It was both strange and cute at the same time. Second Prince Theo was the first person in the history of Veronica Empire to change the prophecy of the temple. Such a thing was only possible for sheer force of will and great risk. Could not be predicted. He could create it for himself and it was quite possible it would save many lives. In all the time she had worked at the palace, Irene had never traveled outside the palace. The only place she had traveled to was the Imperial 7 Citadel, though that was also part of the palace. The journey from the palace to the temple took about an hour. Irene felt the same as when she first arrived at the palace. Villa rode, along with allies in silence, and Basil broke it. He voiced his concerns about Iran to the prince. She seemed suspicious to the aide. After all, she had not entered the academy and she read so well in the ancient language. Even his father had a poor command of the language when he became a priest. The guy in the black jacket suspected that Aaron might be a temple spy if therein really was a spy. That explained why she was looking at His Majesty Theo like that. But Aaron didn't look like a temple spy at all, and no matter how it was still Mr. Theo's girlfriend. The lies was always very cautious, so his suspicions were also understandable. The protagonist stepped out of the carriage and before hosted a huge temple with golden domes and high spires. The goal was in the grip of the Holy of Holies of any theologian. She modelled at the size of the temple, but she had seen it for the first time in her life. His Majesty's ideal plan to expose Iran no matter what cost him. The high priest was told that the imperial carriage had arrived, but alas, the emperor could not be present. The priest immediately concluded that this meant the process of handing over the front. Even the emperor's eldest son was to be the successor, and Prince Via fully supported his candidacy. Never denies favourite daughter Lauren anything, so it was probably just a matter of getting his blessing. The priest had not seen the emperor's children for a long time, even expecting them for a long time. They announced the beginning of the blessing ceremony. Irene had always wanted to dedicate herself to the faith, but as soon as she saw the ceremony, heart fell into her heels. In order for a girl to become a high priest, she had to become an incredible person like him. Two Friends was now in full health, and this was all due to the indispensable support of the church, where it sent letters to Mr. Theo. One of which had just had time to read the obey the order of ceremony. To begin, the priest wanted to tell a new prediction. Irene was happy to see this miracle with her own eyes. They asked Basil's opinion of the high priest for thought, for the true motives were not as bright as they seemed at first glance, much less changing. The prophecy could have dealt a huge blow to the authority of the church. The prince thought that was why the letters were sent in ancient languages. So that no one could know the truth. And before the ceremony, the high priest wanted to speak to the second prince alone. This seems very suspicious to the boy, so he asked his opinion about it. They will have to. The priest wanted to alter the prophecy in advance in order to use this knowledge for his own purposes. During the blessing, a pure white light illuminated the temple. It was a divine revelation. It was God who intervened in Theo's destiny. And changed his fate. God had saved the boy's life. His majesty was blessed as it was. The supreme fight had read prayers, but they have no effect and he now realized why. And the white light that surrounded his majesty was proof of that God could not intervene in the fate of an ordinary man. Villa was the reincarnation of Column. He could change the whole world. It had been 1,000 years since such a miracle had taken place within the temple walls. It happened exactly during the reign of the high priest and he did not want to miss such a chance. Half of the guy's arm was colored black. A guy in a white robe called Irene to him. The guy's name was that in the guy looked familiar to the girl but she wasn't sure. As it turned out he was Basil's brother. They did look alike, then he put his hand on the girl's back and a bright yellow color with a green edge lit up. It was a treatment and it was complete. It was incredible, for Aaron's lower back no longer hurts when you got down on one knee in front of her and lowered his head. The golden understand why Theo kept kneeling down in front of. The fact that Prince Theo had been blessed by the Lord himself was unbelievable. It was the first time anyone had seen such an act, and she herself had once actively studied theology. Via really deserve this blessing. His Majesty invited Iran to come to his room at night. She wondered why, but did more the boy to save out loud. In the courtyard of the palace, the servants were actively discussing a blessing of a second prince. The knight was saying that God always blesses. Veronica, Hero's 2 servant, didn't believe it and thought it was just another political ploy. Iran believed in Theo. Irene didn't come at night as she agreed with Theo. Because he had a night shift. If there were no night shifts, the girl would have enjoyed coming to the second prince. The Lord invited his servant to come to his house for the night. I really thought that they had slept together on the spur of the moment and that his majesty wanted to play with her. But with each passing day she understood less and less of his train of thought. But after that night, she decided that she wouldn't worry about it anymore. After all, that difference in status was still an insurmountable barrier, and the girl still did not understand what kind of relationship she and the prince had. Because Irene was thinking about it, she accidentally overflowed that Ian broke the cup. He told her about it. She immediately started to clean it up and accidentally hurt her foot, but the prince took her by the tips of her slender fingers and stutter. He took her in his arms and set her on the couch. All the spilled tea still needed to be cleaned up, so he called another servant to do the job. They leaned against a leg, just as he had on their first meeting. Irene apologized for her clumsiness. It seemed to her that she was only getting in Mr. Fear's way. She was ahead of her servants, but she had made stupid mistakes. Watched him and helped for the paperwork. She was doing a good job in general. The protagonist was always helping His Highness and Basil with documents. The prince convinced the girl that without her everything would have grown dusty long ago. Mr. Theo would be late for every meeting if Irene didn't prepare his clothes. And thanks to this gold views, life was much easier. He had chosen Iran to be a servant and all the girl's mistakes for his own. All of his words made no sense to Irene. After all, servants were not supposed to make mistakes ever. And from the reason this fact was known to everyone. Saying these things anyway kept caring and comforting Irene. He always said what she wanted to hear. Theo and Irene were in bed. The prince asked to be called by his name, but Your Majesty involuntarily popped from the girl's list. Wanted to spend the whole night with the servant in bed. She wouldn't call him by his name. It was night outside. Basil had relayed that they would have to arrive at the temple at dawn tomorrow. The girl standing next to him knew that this did not bode well for Captain Theo. Irene walked into the office to drop off the paperwork. And so, an unfamiliar brunette there it was Monet. She was dressed in a black suit and had a high ponytail on her head. She began to tell Mr. Theo how the mission was going. The marauders had taken over the northern passage to the Camel Mountains. Negotiations were unsuccessful, so they had to deal with it differently. Several holy artifacts were stolen from that, but they should be returned to the palace in Monet. Reported that she had been contacted by the church. There was marked with the mark of the apocalypse, and after him the church was looking for another. The mark of the apocalypse was a RAF anonymous, and only those blessed by God was subject to it. An avatar is an intermediary between a blessed person and God, and anyone who spoke to the prince could become his personal vital. And because of this search, the church contacted everyone the second prince knew, but no one knew what kind of avatar they have found for Theo. Theo didn't understand why he would be summoned to the temple for such a small thing, but it was a huge concern for the church. This event could change the course of history, the identity of the avatar the temple wanted to reveal on the second prince's birthday. This was all strange and Theo had a bad feeling about it. If the church had already chosen another time, it meant that they were an extremely close person to Mr. Theo. The second prince didn't care about that. After all, he had enough troubles as it was. He asked Monet to pass this on and for the church to handle it themselves. Mr. Tere's instructions I really wanted to leave as well, but Theo grabbed her by her dress and talked about how the girl needed a break since she was already running around a lot. The servant still had work to do, but the second prince insisted that she rest and not overworked. The girl asked Theo about the avatar. Was he really not interested? If it were him, Irene would have died of curiosity. The prince replied that he already had a lot on his plate and asked the girl to talk to him while he filled out the paperwork. Everyone underestimated the prince and thought she would only get in the way with her chatter. They wanted to talk about Irene, so she started a story about her family. There were 5 children in a family. Her mum was always busy, so the girl always took care of her siblings by herself. She had a lot of experience in household chores and that's why she became a servant. Irene didn't have a father. He died when she was still young. He was drafted into the war and died on battlefield. The girl's mother worked as a maid for an oriental writer and learned from him. But the imperial palace hired servants and that's how I really got into the palace. Before her daughter left, her mother made her homemade shoes, but Irene didn't have many occasions to wear them. The girl wrote to them constantly and Phil wondered if they were all right. The girl's salary was enough to help. Understood why she was preparing to enter the academy but never managed to study that. It was always the goal was carrying the whole family on her shoulders. The guy was absolutely right that Irene would never betray him. Basil came to tell Mr. Theo about the other, but he was already aware it had already been reported to him by Monet. The eye to gather all the information about Irene, but there was nothing suspicious there. But Basil was shown to always be on his guard. Theo asked that Bale check to make sure Irene wasn't a spy, but only so she wouldn't find out the second prince wanted to introduce Iran at his birthday party. He was sure that the person at Temple wanted to send would not be reliable and we just want to gain the prince's trust. It was expected because they have received the blessing of God and through the avatar the temple wanted to build a connection with him. The captain was very glad that Basil was on his side. Basil was unrequitedly in love with Monet, so he sent her many letters about Irene, although one would have sufficed. Few told his assistant that rash behavior was bad, but he was the same way. Irene stood by the window and View's office and completed his birthday suit. When everything was perfect, Monet came up to her and asked for records of the undeveloped northern lands. The servant gave her what she asked for. The girl in the black suit told her what Basil had written about her in his letters. They had seen each other recently but had not had time to get to know each other because when it was so busy she introduced herself to Iran as His Majesty's assistant. The girls shook hands. Basil sometimes wrote to monitor and in one of his letters he mentioned the maid's name. He did not tell her anything special, but the head of the maid was surprised that Basil mentioned her in his letters. The helper told his lover that Theo and Irene were in love with each other on it, promised not to tell anyone and wished the young people happiness. Irene understood that it would be terrible if the rumors began to spread because it could cause problems for both her and His Majesty. This vote was very disturbing to her. Monet walked down the hallway thinking about her new acquaintance. She was very nice and Basil was blind not to notice it. The prince's assistant now understood why he was in love. It was the birthday of a second prince. Theo is personal maid and the lady of his heart. Irene helped him to get ready. The guy was very grateful to have that the couple had to go because the ceremony was about to begin. The emperor walked into the huge pool that was filled with people, in fact everyone present for coming to wish his son a happy birthday. The emperor made the announcement that his son had been blessed by the Lord and then go with her white. As Snow and Papa risen to the hall, she was dressed in all white. It was the avatar of the second prince. She was honored to be present at this event. Vi was outraged that his avatar turned out to be a girl, and I realized that there was only more trouble to come. It was an honor for the girl to speak to the emperor himself. The girl's name was Sonia Dale. It seems she was the daughter of Jason Dave himself. His Highness wishes Sonia good time. Lauren was outraged at the average. I had the nerve to come dressed in white. It wasn't a wedding after all. Even came up behind Theo and wished his brother happy birthday. The princess was upset with Even for not wishing her a happy birthday. The princess was offended at Even for not wishing her a happy birthday. Lauren jokes. Even Irene from Stand Him and Majesty just didn't know about the relationship. Even had a lot to do and after congratulating his brother he left. The prince was very attentive to Theo, but everyone present is only paying attention to those affected people only cared about the girl. The birthday boy noted that it had been a long time since the palace had such a colourful personality, not to mention the fact that there hadn't been Avatar in 1,000 years. Lauren thought it was all nonsense since they hadn't come to see a new other top video came down from the balcony into the hole. Came to him at once to congratulate him and apologize for the fact that she didn't even have a chance to introduce himself. The second prince didn't need it, but the girl insisted on their acquaintance, because in the future they would see each other much more often. Via asked Irene where the urgent documents she had spoken up where they were in his study, and the prince went there immediately. The servant tried to stop him, but it was all in vain. The head servant noticed the other days she had the same look in the past. Mr. Theo twisted the breech of his suit. But it might have broken because of that. So the OS tyrant to take it off His Majesty was tired for the day. Via was constantly being bothered and bored by everyone. He didn't understand why everyone needed him so much. He was part of the ruling family and obviously he needed to keep his space in public. Irene asked for the other prince to raise his hand, but the place he did so he pulled it to him and sat on his lap. The guy asked from 8 to wish him a happy birthday and the best gift from the girl would be that she would stop overworking. After all, Mr. Theo had taken her in to spend more time together, and Irene worked even harder than he did. They asked if it was okay to kiss a girl. If Irene said no, you wouldn't do it. The prince was turned on by everything Is never did. This was the way the head of the servants wished his master happy birthday. The girl was still thinking about the avatar, and there was obviously something wrong with it. Remember this beautiful girl? And he had really looked into her appearance. Even the fact that she was his avatar had learned from. The girl had worked for the next day and was about to leave the second prince, but he stopped her with his passionate kiss because he only wanted her in the morning that I woke up early and watched how sweetly his object of admiration slept. At that moment she was very calm and peaceful and as soon as she opened her eyes she would become very active. His assistant came into Fear's room and wanted to report something, but the second prince kicked him out. The two of them left the room and Fear listened intently to what they wanted to tell him. There's all had no idea why he needed the second prince so early, but it was his job to bring him. They didn't like the news after all. He wanted to get some rest that day the boys didn't have much time left. Theo went to get dressed and while the prince went to do so, he instructed the assistant to prepare a change of clothes for Irene. Theo along with Basil arrived at the emperor's palace and they were met by a man he was honored to be near His Majesty. The emperor was waiting for the boys in his garden and the two of them went to meet the emperor. The second friend was curious about what his father planned to talk to him about. The young man went into a huge cabin of unknown beauty where the emperor was looking out of the window and waiting patiently for them. He invited his son to the table. He called him so early for fear, servants have reported to His Majesty, but the lad was already awake at such a time and was going to practice. The boy took a mug of tea and started drinking it. He concluded that the Iran had made. Was much Castillo, father? Asked Theo it enjoy the banquet in his honor, but the second prince didn't notice anything unusual at the banquet. There were just more people, music and alcohol than usual. The emperor wanted to talk to his son about the girl who was at the celebration and turned out to be an avatar. Now she was to be called a SD because she'd been chosen by God and was also rather modest and sweet girl. It was natural for Sonia Dale because she was a reincarnation of God. The emperor had been in communication with the men of the temple a few days before his conversation with his son, and they made a proposal to marry Mr. Theo and Sonia too. Prince was puzzled. This marriage was very important to the empire. Through it imperial family and the temple could make a centuries-old alliance video with a mug of tea on the table and asked him to stop rambling. The emperor pretended not to hear it. This wedding was necessary not only for a successful union but also to show his gratitude for saving his life. It was an opportunity to show his gratitude. The emperor asked his son to think about it. But he didn't need time to think about it. He clearly knew there would be no wedding as the Emperor wanted to repay the saving of his son's life. He would have been better off lavishing gold rather than using Theo for a political marriage, pretending as if he meant something to his father. After that, Mr. Field reflected. Basil didn't know whether it was worth it to refuse His Majesty so harshly, but the boy was unbending in his decision. He didn't run to do his father's bidding, for marriages should be for love, not profit. Out of anger, the boy hit the wall in front of him. Promised that he would never let this marriage happen. After all, if you earn the same for to marry, you can forget about Iran forever. A servant woke up in her master's bed and noticed that he was gone. She needs to tidy up her clothes. At first she needed something to wear and she put His Majesty's row, and at the same second a guy in a black suit walked into the second princess room. He didn't know that the girl was in the room. Mr. Theo wasn't that Irene managed to hide behind the bed. Before that I saw her, it was removed and she didn't understand what he was doing in Mr. Theo's room. Is she caught his eye? There would be rumors about her. The head of the servants wanted the boy to leave quickly. Rule didn't understand why His Highness needed a maid costume that I heard some noise under the bed where Irene was hiding. He thought it was rats. Roe was about to look under the bed when Mr. Theo came in the door and asked what the boy was doing. He answered that he had brought the maid's costume and put it on the table. They didn't need him anymore, so he went on with his business as soon as the boy was out the door. Irene called out of her imaginary hiding place. She had a wound on her leg as if she had hurt herself while hiding from an unexpected guest. And told her to apply healing ointment, keep the wound from getting inflamed. And tried to convince her master that she was fine, but the breeze that appeared around the wound on her leg said otherwise. Aaron was very pleased with his master's concern, why is already the second principal, and worried and volunteered to help the girl. The maid was in good spirits, it seems. A bruise really didn't hurt. Mr. Theo hopes that Erin wouldn't hurt herself again in his absence. She should have taken care of herself even when the prince was around. The girl agreed with that. It was strange to Irene, but first His Majesty Theo seemed to her a rough and unpleasant man. But the more she got to know him, the more she became convinced that he was a very good and kind man. The girl asked where was Theo after all. When she woke up, she didn't find him around. He told her that the Emperor just wanted to see him. She really wanted to know. It happened, but it was unlikely that the second friends would discuss his affairs with a servant girl. When I reinstalled about it, she began to worry about the difference in their status. Isla noticed that the girl was wearing his clothes. She justified it by saying that she needed to tidy up her clothes and grabbed. The first thing that came to hand on the table was the dress that she had brought in the morning. The head of the servants was feeling fine, and the prince told her that since it was so eager first it was time for him to go. He told her to get dressed and go out when she was ready in the corridor. The girl saw Raoul. He was on his way to His Majesty's room to clean it, but Irene told him that she had just come from the and it was such a mess that she had decided to clean it herself. Another boy had less work to do. The boy been at once and also told him that there was a mouse in the princess room, but he didn't know that the mouse was Irene. Thelma was talking about some use to Raoul. They were two more of those gossipy people. But Irene wasn't supposed to pay attention to it. It was none of her business and she had work to do, and excited Thelma ran into Iran's study and told her the big news that all the servants were already discussing. The second Prince Theo was to marry Sonia Dale. The girls were on the princess' birthday and that was why His Majesty Theo had a meeting with the high priest. Irene was shocked and Phil in turn said it was true, for His Majesty was close to Sonia. That was why everything changed with her appearance, and they got along so well with the second prince as if they were made for each other ahead. Maid was filling out paperwork and trying not to think about what she had learned, but the thought of how well they would look together kept her busy. It was hurting Irene because she was distracted. The ink stained the paper. A girl appeared behind Thelma and took her by the shoulder. It was Eva, and she had accidentally startled Thelma with her abrupt appearance. She told me that the master wants to see her and was waiting in the garden. Thanked the servant for warning her and went to the appointed place. Every turn to Irene. She needed to talk to her about something. Eva said that the rumors of Mr. Theo's marriage were probably true, and that she had told her to keep out of the way of the other servants. Friend for her concern, but there was no time for thanks. At that point, Eva admitted to Aaron that if she were in his shoes she would have cried by now. But Aaron was not allowed to show her true feelings. The maid advised the girl to stay away from His Highness PEO because he was going to marry another woman and be with her. Only it wasn't just a girl, she was a saint, and even if I really had a special relationship with Theo associating with. Eva understood what the girl was going through, but she had to stop it and go her own way. She needed to keep a distance with Theo and she promised to try to do that. Sun just seemed to like the prince. And if the two were really engaged, the only thing I really could do was to wish the young ones happiness. I reinvent the documents that Mr. Theo asked for. He was leading the meeting and was almost finished. He said that the girl could wait for him. The head of the servants did not want to refuse, but lied that she still had one more thing to do. The second principal is strange, for it was already night. The servant wished him a good rest and bowed out. A guy asked why she was working overtime. To this, the girl replied that she had a backlog of things to do. The guy asked her not to leave, he would take care of all her business. He took the girl by the shoulders, but she pushed him away and justified it by saying that she just wanted to leave. You inquired what was the matter with her that she was reacting like. But the girl didn't answer anything. I didn't interfere and let her go. In response, she wished him a good day. Monet and Basil stood behind. The prince is back and discussed exactly what Irene had asked him to do. He told him to shut up and explained that there had been a lot going on lately and she was just tired of all the worries, and that was why the second friends had let her go. The next day you said hello to Irene. But she replied that she had a lot to do again today. Few days later, Iran similarly found excuses not to see him. This time she was having a woman's day. A few more days passed and she was still running from the guy the same way. The girl was already tired of running and playing hide and seek with him. It was hard for her to even meet his gaze. Via asked directly if the girl was angry with him. She answered in the negative and the guy asked why she was acting so strange. Lately, Iran pretended not to understand what was going on, but they clearly wanted to know why she was avoiding him. After all, they were doing well. The servant had told him that she just wanted to reduce their communication to zero. They thought that some rumor had reached Irene, but she refuted this statement. He understood and let the goal go. Irene ended her relationship with her boyfriend. She got over it all. She had left with the bandages of a second prince used to wrap her legs with the first time that she held him in her hands at that moment as a memory of her time. Her eyes were wet, but she convinced herself that one should not cry because of some stupidity. She was not in a position to cry, but his still rolled down her face and did not obey the girl. She believed that everything would definitely get better. The main character came to see an older man with glasses. He asked if Irene wanted another job. She had recently changed duties on behalf of His Highness Theo. The girl knew that one could only change the field of work for a good reason. She asked the man very much to think about her request commands, that he didn't think it was hard for them to cope. It seemed to him that she had settled in as a servant to His Highness Villa, but apparently that wasn't the case. He ordered the girl to get back to work. She thanked him. Irene did her best and did her best. She only had to survive a ceremony of saying goodbye to the Empress coins. Latest report is looking to see Theo. His Highness asked if you've read his instructions. He answered a new affirmative. It already read them. The idea protagonist replied that there were no rumors floating around the castle. If only her reputation. And he knew how to find good people. That meant there was no gossip. His Highness thought about the fact that she was avoiding him because of that. Every time a go passed by, she completely ignored his existence, as if nothing had ever happened between them. You felt like he was going crazy after all. He couldn't even find out why his lover had such tearful eyes. Basil realized that his master's thoughts were all about this girl, but in fact there were rumors that he was going to marry his divine Arbetta. Perhaps they were false and someone was spreading them on purpose. The servant didn't understand that he had to report this to His Highness. Mr. Theo asked for the man wanted to tell him. His servant kept silent about what he knew, and answered that he didn't want to tell him anything. The protagonist noticed that the guy was acting strange and even a little suspicious. It meant that there were no rumors about him. Basil thought about how it was good that Irene was the first to reject him, even though it seems strange the boy told the law that maybe the girl was just tired of him. Maybe the main character was just boring her. It would be weird if the girl asked for everything to stop just because of that. Theo told his servants he was the one who was fed up with and he dismissed him from his post. And from that moment on, it would report everything to His Highness. The boy was shocked by such news. He hadn't even considered such a development. Irene was lying on her bed in her room, awakened by the gentle rays of sunlight that streamed through the window and gently tickled her face. She got up and realized that was the very day she had most unwanted. Quite a few people were following His Highness Theo. He said that the forgiveness ceremony would be held at the temple. The girl who was following him informed him that there would be a lot of. Therefore, he needed to refrain from talking too much in Irene's mind. The only thought on her mind was that this day would just end. She greeted the man, an avatar that stood in front of her. They have stepped in front of Iran. He asked. Why the hell was the avatar in his territory again? She greeted him and told him they hadn't seen each other in a while. The priest said that Sonia herself had expressed a desire to attend that event. They were all very happy that the emphasis would once again be in the arms of God and His Highness. Theo added that his late mother would have been very happy about that as well. Of course, that was sarcasm. The main character said that even on the day of his mother's funeral, we had to be there. His father justified this by saying that he had a very hard day and that was why he behaved that way. Sun just said she would be happy to honor the impressed with Theo. Everyone went to the place where the farewell was held, but only Irene was not allowed in. She was asked to wait somewhere else, but for tagging is thought it was a sign from above. She was not allowed to go near him, much less be with him. The girl decided to take a walk while she was waiting and someone called out to her. She turned around and it was about him calling her. It was a rather unexpected meeting for young people. The boy assumed that it must have been His Highness Theo attending the Empress farewell ceremony. Aaron confirmed that the protagonist Oscar acquaintance there was a place somewhere where she could have privacy. She was told to. The ceremony would last over an hour ago. We want to pray during that time. She needed to save her soul. That is that he will be led her to a beautiful building. There was nothing unusual about it, but it was still working on. The protagonist asked if she was allowed to be in that sacred place. She got a favorable response to that. Anyone was allowed in that building. The boy told her to stay there and he had to go. Irene's servant thanked him for his kindness. The girl walked over and began an invocation to the court. To be healthy in body and spirit. It turned out that she was not alone in that place, but the man present did not show that he was there. He was just watching her. His Highness the Aside walked around the grounds and thought about the fact that not only was it boring, but her whole body was aching. I wondered what non-religious people did to pass the time. A uniformed girl peeked over to where Irene was. Someone called out to her, but she told her not to interfere. She watched the main character. It was very unusual to watch a servant pray. Some guy was asleep in the seats because that wealthier servant was praying. He said hello to the girl. She didn't realize it was addressed to her. The young man was staring at her very intensely, the member of the heavily sexed. What is new acquaintances? Name was Irene wondered who it was. He looked special, his clothes were made of expensive fabric and he was wearing unusual jewelry. It was unclear why such a person would know the name of an ordinary servant. The protagonists have already started to speak, but the man interrupted her and apologized. He didn't want to make her uncomfortable. The man's name was Hales Telford, that Ilford family. It was one of the Marquess families of the Veronica Empire. This guy became the Marquess and head of the family when his predecessor suddenly passed away. Aaron said that the young man might not have spoken to her so respectfully. The girl introduced herself to her new acquaintance and said that she worked as a servant in the Imperial Palace. It was the price of the profession of the protagonist, she told him. That day there was a farewell ceremony for the Empress. She followed the carriage of the Imperial family Hales, suggested that a servant from the Imperial Palace walk and talk to him. Of course, she'd already said her prayers. They walked down the path and the boy said it was a lovely place to walk. Irene was at a loss to guess what he wanted to talk to her about. The market began to say something. Accidentally stumbled and began to fall. At that moment the young man's strong hands called the maid. He told the one to be more careful. The protagonist immediately distanced itself from him and thanked him. She was all right. Ailes reacted in time and picked up the clumsy acquaintance. Even in such a situation the protagonist did not forget about manners. This pleasantly surprised the guy. He asked if the girl had to stay in that place. Until the end of the ceremony she answered positively to this and added that her new acquaintance should address her on you. He didn't want to do that. I replied to my reign as she felt more comfortable that way he would honor her request. Mr. Hales said goodbye to the girl and said see you soon. Did that mean they would meet again? The young man couldn't promise anything, but he knew something. He was aware of the fact that his new acquaintance. Many things to worry about. The member of the strongest exit had a prayer, but promised that he would not tell anyone about it. Marquez began to tell Iran that faced in fade just because one could open his heart to God. Whenever the man had a problem, he would come to the temple. That day he came after work to calm his mind and he was lucky enough to meet a servant of the imperial palace. Backtails would be in the capital for a few more days. Many people were said to have found their auditors in a temple. He was a very intelligent and perceptive man, but it was unclear why he switched from one topic to another so quickly. Pale saw to himself, added Sonia Dale prayed for 2 years but healing of the prince's wounds. Plagued by the fact that all of this was strange. After all, one could only get the divine Avita's blessing by talking to him, but certainly was clearly not the only ones they had talked to. You found her so quickly and that was strange enough. Inefficient. This girl looked autumn impatient as he was getting stronger at the other's expense the mark. We spoke to her as well and watching. She looked like an ordinary aristocrat. She was called the divine. Things were even more interesting when the young man had anticipated. What are you taking away in the temple? Proof. Nothing. But he trusted his inner voice. Mr. offered Irene another meeting. He wanted to see just the two of them. It was very unexpected for Protectionist, even shocking. She asked what a new acquaintance meant. After all, they knew each other. Only nothing. It seemed a little suspicious to the girl. There was nothing so criminal in it, His Highness. Theatres made apologize democracies. Before she could say anything, she was pulled back. It was her master. She was surprised to see him. She didn't understand how he was in that place. It's getting more interesting. The prince asked what they were doing. The farewell ceremony was probably over by now. Hale said hello to the protagonist, but had not. Him and also Iran what she was doing that. The celebration, it turns out, was still going home. They said it was stuffy in there, so he decided to take a walk. His Highness once again asked what his maid was doing there and not alone. She replied that she had gone to pray to pass the time and they strike up a conversation with Mark. Please telephone. The protagonist held his beloved by the cheek as if to show that she was already busy. Mr. Hales, for the fear, didn't seem to have hurt him and greeted him again. As well as introducing himself. His Highness. The prince was clearly unfriendly and simply replied to the male representative that he understood. He didn't even try to hide his dislike for him. Was it really all cause of one day? Irene said that there must have been looking for the ceremony. She offered to escort him out and she said goodbye to Hales. His Highness walked very fast in front of the girl and the girl asked him to wait for her. She wanted to go together, the protagonist called. Waste. He asked who was this man they were having such a nice conversation with. Irene said that he did introduce himself, didn't he? The protagonist asked if they had known each other before that moment. The maid answered in the negative. That's when they snapped into a yell and aggressively asked then why the hell were they working together? I really thought about what had made him so angry, the fact that she didn't spend the night with him. The protection is replied that they had just met this Mr. Temple and strike up a conversation. And anyway, what did the prince care who his servant was? Talking to him about it already found the one he was going to marry? His Highness said that the protagonist was laughing at him. He thought that the guy had no time to finish as he was interrupted by Irene and announced that he was the one who played with her and her feelings. The protagonist didn't understand what his lover meant. She replied that he knew how his personal servant felt about his person, but he still used her as a toy and now he had to marry someone else. The main character didn't know what to do. She was trying to get him out of the heart now. The prince interrupted her. He said he had never lied to her. He swore to her to hold her face and pulled her to him for a kiss. The young man asked who did you think have become his chosen one? He didn't understand who. She was talking about on the protagonist explained that everyone was talking about an imminent wedding to start Estonia. It had been announced in public by one of his cronies. Now the protagonist realized what the matter was. He asked. Was this the reason why the personal servant ignored the guy's existence and tried to avoid His Highness in all different ways? The girl replied that she could not do otherwise if he were to marry another girl. But I have a row his lover and told her to continue. He pinned her hands to the wall. The girl did not understand what he was doing. After all they could be seen. The young prince started kissing her neck and replied that there was no one there and no one could see them. This race is space and looking into the eyes of the personal servants that he had long ago refused that proposal and he would not marry. As soon as the emperor brought up the topic of marriage, the main character immediately refused to do so. In that case, Irene didn't understand why there were rumors about it around the palace. This was exactly what the guy was going to find out. Other than his father, no one could spread such gossip since they would check it out and find out the truth. The young man asked his girlfriend if there were any misunderstandings between them. Now she did not answer him, so he asked if there was anything else that Agnes was worried about. She answered in the negative and apologized to her lover for making him worry. He couldn't find a place for himself because of these worries. But she didn't need to apologize for it. The girl tried to object and said that she was serving His Majesty after all. They had wanted to ask her for a long time now for the protagonist. Think the prince treated like a servant. If that was the case you wouldn't be trying to get her attention. He wasn't an idiot who couldn't figure out his feelings. The guy was old enough to be messing with someone's head over his uncertainty. He reached for Iran again to sink his lips into hers and said he couldn't live without that. He asked if the rumors are upset the main character. She replied that. Absolutely not. The girl started crying in his arms. She felt safe next to the prince. She never thought that she would ever hear a declaration of love from His Majesty, and even though feelings had played out between them, unfortunately the difference in statues hadn't gone anywhere. But at least on that day she could be happy in the study. The man asked the editor of the prince, was it that hard to make him fall in love with her? He didn't understand why this useless girl couldn't manage such a basic task. The priest was saying, Sophie replied that she couldn't control His Majesty's feelings. At these words the man became furious. What do you mean she couldn't? Could she had to do it? She told herself that she loved Prince Theo with all her soul, and that's why the priest may have the divine avatar of the protagonist. If she was given the chance, she had to take it. Jenyor had to find out how she could win the guy's heart. The man believed in her success in this endeavor. Hales rode in the carriage and thought about the ambiguous relationship between Prince Theo. After all, he was witnessing is more like a lover's plural, and His Highness was overly anxious about the whole frame. It was very interesting. Such information. Irene brought candy for Theo and told him to get good night's rest, and she still had things to do. The boy asked when there any other servers in the palace she could quietly ask them to do the job. The protagonist replied that she didn't feel comfortable asking them to do it. It was better for her to leave work. Early in, the protagonist pressed himself against his beloved and said that he was really hoping for this. He started kissing her beautiful and small face, later said that his heart was tingling to the point of terror. The young man placed his personal make him on his chest so that she could feel his heartbeat. She replied there was beating very hard, and then he pulled her against his body and they merged in a kiss. That's why it was itching. Their assistant walked into his room and saw them. She came right out, but I had was not filled with books. That Irene was indeed his divine overtime feels personal maids and a huge mountain of papers that stood on the box they almost covered. She was asked if she was sure she could carry it all herself. She answered in the affirmative to that question, but Agnes said it would be hard, but she could handle it. To her, it was better than just sitting around doing nothing. In fact another servant for helping her sort through paperwork. Monet met Basil in the hallway. The boy did not understand what she was doing that place. He saw Irene and the two young people came to the conclusion that it looked like he and His Highness had a fight. It was indeed so. The Theo had ceased to be angry with Basil. The two assistants looked after the departing goals. The guy said he didn't even know if it was good or not, but something was obviously not clean. He didn't want to say anything without figuring it out. Money to agree with that statement. It was the right thing to do. They needed to find out everything on a mandatory basis. I really did take too many papers. She couldn't see anything in front of us. She bumped into some man and the papers went flying. He told the girl that he would help her collect them. It was a marquis. The protagonist in no way expected to see him in that place. Here they met again. The protagonist's personal servant greeted the young man. He asked her if she could handle such a pile of documents by herself. She replied that of course she could, but she asked him Hales to put the folders that papers on the box that was already in their hands. He told her not to have a servant worry to all the folders himself and asked where they would be taken. He wanted to help his acquaintance. Aaron said that there was no need to do that and she could handle itself, but the young man was categorical and could not allow a fragile girl to pull such heavy things. The protagonist. Most of the market wasn't busy. He replied that he had to meet His Highness to discuss something and he had already finished his business. What happened between her and Fear? It seemed to him that the prince was very worried about the servants. The girl asked the marquis to address her as you and asked him not to forget it. When they next met, the young man asked if she remembered the previous conversation. He translated it into a joke. Hales apologized for that and added that the protagonist looks very funny when she was nervous. The fact that she remembered the previous conversation. The man said he would consider her request next time, but he had no idea that the meeting would take place under such circumstances. Irene was a little confused what he meant that he didn't want them to run into each other suddenly. Hales asked if he could call a servant of the Imperial Palace simply by his first name. The girl replied that yes of course he could, especially considering the difference in their status. Hales asked if he could call a servant of the Imperial Palace simply by his first name. The girl replied that yes, of course he could afford it, especially with the difference in their state. She says the young man talked about how he wanted to meet the protagonist when she wanted to do so herself. Iran didn't understand what the difference was. But the Marquise convinced her that there really was one, even though it was a coincidence. But then their meeting was inevitable. He spoke in overly complicated words. Apparently it was a habit of his. The young people had already arrived at their destination. And Irene told the guy to give her the papers and thank the Marquis for the help they have delivered. He hoped that they would have another meeting. The protagonist asked him again about addressing her in a less formal manner. Hale said he would think about her suggestion. He turned it into a joke again. I guess that was his way of speaking. Iran thought about the fact that the market was a very unusual man and it was amazing that they had met again. Well, it was good that these meetings didn't happen often. The head of the maids, however, was sorely mistaken in thinking so they met again, Markley said. But if there were 3 coincidences in a row, it was fate. I replied that if the boy came to see His Majesty Theo, she could take him to him, but there was no need. Hales had come to talk to her. Apparently the Marquis wanted to say that he was interested in Irene. The young man covered her hands with his and was surprised that the girl realized it. Only now she distanced herself and said she would pretend. As she hadn't heard anything, he inquired why. The protagonist replied that it was because she wanted to because she was already attracted to someone. The head maid said she had to go and wished her was a good day, after which she disappeared from sight by thought about the fact that she wouldn't just open her heart to someone. The Veronica Empire had established a very strange relationship between the imperial family and the church. At that moment, their relationship was completely dependent on the emperor's complacency towards the church. The throne was occupied by a deeply religious man. If he finds out that the divine avatar proposed by the church was false and that there is a real one, the emperor would reward whoever pointed it out. The Marquis decided he should have left that place for a while. His Majesty Theo was looking out the window, and Basil wondered what he was watching so closely. It last, rhetorically, why that had started to catch his eye so often. I didn't understand who he was talking about, and the protagonist pointed him to the Markles of Tilford. Basil repeatedly told His Highness to call people by their proper names. They asked, was he supposed to know who it was? The boy replied that absolutely not, but one had to remain polite. A lot of stares were directed at him, especially lately. Prince Theo didn't understand why this sucker had come to the palace. Was this pastor really coming to see Iran? Just thinking about it made His Highness anxious and angry. Is John disease? Began to go faster and faster, and his eyes filled with blood and rage. The protagonist decided that he needed to meet this young man and have a face-to-face talk. Basil really hoped it wasn't about Marcus Tilford. Theo came to Irene, the girl said. Wasn't he supposed to be in the study? She wondered why the one. The protagonist didn't let her finish and said that they needed to talk urgently. She didn't understand why he was taking her. The prince threw his beloved on the bed and lay on top of her. The protagonist asked what was wrong. His Highness asked as she had seen him. Something was off. Or rather the guy couldn't express himself like that and corrected the word to Marquis. Irene told the truth that yes, they met in front of the palace. The protagonist asked if Hales had come to see her. His girlfriend replied that she probably did. The guy, with a nervous smile on his face, said that this indicated that he had come specifically to see her the head. May replied that she had run into him quite often lately. His Highness the Prince asked what they were talking about. The protagonist replied that he simply asked her where she was going. He also helped her. Mr. Theo became furious that Hales had helped her. Iran said that there really wasn't anything strange or supernatural about it. His Majesty's personal servant said she was only his anyway, and the young man already knew she only liked him. They lay together and their little fingers intertwined. It was a very sweet gesture. It was the first time the boy had heard that his lover liked him. Those words were like butter to his soul. Prince Theo was very embarrassed by these words, and Irene in turn repeated them again. She asked why the protagonist had such a negative attitude towards the Marquis. His Highness was simply worried about that falling into the soul of his favorite person. In fact, he didn't understand why the head of the servants liked him. Irene asked in turn what the prince liked her for. The boy started to say that in order to lift his spirits. Then before going to bed, the girl shut his mouth with her hands and said that if the reason was what she was thinking it would be better at. His Highness didn't say anything. Mr. Theo replied that it was a joke. He really liked the fact that the main character did a lot of things for him. He could never imagine how hard it was to work for others. Many people worked as hard for the emperor as the head of the servants. Did these all people what did the prince let them to? His Highness said that his beloved was crazy to say such things, and she was the only one he had his heart set on. Iran said that was not the reason for his sympathy for her modest person. The guy couldn't explain to her why it started happening. Just at one point, he began to wait for a meeting with her. The protagonist simply fell in love with his maid. And he was not confused at all by the difference in status. For him, there was no one but this beautiful girl there. Let's meld it together. And after the guy distanced himself from the protagonist, he said. He felt very ashamed of his confession. Irene understood him. She explained that their meeting with the Marquis was indeed a coincidence. Therefore, he could not worry about it. A heart belonged to him forever. Mr. Theo sat in his office, banging his head against the desk. Because of the stress. Monet and Basil came in. The boy said he couldn't stand that. Marquis, his assistant, said. It was really not normal. Monette asked. How long had Hales been interested in? Is Irene as far as His Highness Theo knew from the farewell ceremony? If from the ceremony, then the Marquise had seen her in the temple as well. The prince inquired why Monet needed this information. She replied that she just asked it for interest. The protagonist replied that the assistant was just like Basil. The guy didn't really like that comparison. His Highness Theo didn't understand what caused his aides to fall silent. But no matter how it was, Erin still said that she liked the main character that had calmed him down. But jealousy still flowed through his veins, and he could burst into flames from it at any moment. Irene decided that she had to do something about it. She went to some man, and he asked if she had come to him again for flowers. The main representative looked like a very nice and kind man. The protagonist really did come for flowers. The girl forgot to change the water, because of which these beautiful plants dried up a little. Plants are very sensitive creatures, so they must always be cared for. A man told Oren this fight. He gave her one flower and told her to follow him. They came to a field that was strewn with flowers. They were quite different kinds, but each one was wonderful in its own way. A guy in a black suit ran up to the gardener and asked him to wait. He asked to check the decorations of the banquet hall. The man told the head of the servants that he had to leave for a while, but during this time the protagonists could pick those flowers that she liked. The girl replied that she would wait for him. This time of flowers were very bright and beautiful. Last time they were paler. It would be great to decorate His Highness. There's study. The servant of the Imperial Palace was picking plants in a very good mood behind the protagonist. She turned around. It was Hales. He apologized for scaring her. Irene greeted the Marquis. Was she really uncomfortable enough around this man? The young man asked her what Fear's lover had been up to. She answered briefly and matter-of-factly she had come for flowers. For her part the protagonist asked to counter-question what was the Marquis doing there. He answered that he had seen Irene in that place and added that the palace garden was terribly beautiful. He was really putting too much pressure on the poor girl as he understood it. The protagonist was planning to pick a bouquet. The monkeys plucked a flower. Irene replied that it was not necessary to do so. The young man thought that in that place it was possible to just pluck these noble plants. The protagonist said that there was nothing wrong with it, but she would rather just cut them off. Hales noted that the head maid knew what she was doing. She liked flowers very much. That probably wasn't a man who didn't like them, but the Marquis was the exception to the rule. The girl became embarrassed and replied that all sorts of things were possible. There were those who didn't like flowers. The young man asked what attracted such a beautiful girl to the flowers. She replied that the plants were very beautiful and smelled nice. Ah, so they could also color an ordinary life. Irene asked. Wasn't the Markles tired of everyday life? Ailes replied that he was indeed very tired. As soon as he finished one job, he would wait for the next one to appear. Sometimes the joy of success was replaced by boredom. The main character handed the guy some flowers and told him to put them in his room. Perhaps they will melt his heart and their beauty will fall into his soul, a servant of the Imperial Palace suggested, starting with roses. After all, they had a beautiful, delicate, slightly bold scent. The boy didn't understand why his heart started beating faster. I ran, showed him a Roseanne, said. She would cut it for him. The protagonist hoped that now Mr. Hales would stop being indifferent to plants. He thanked her. She had completely forgotten she still had things to do, and it was time to go. She turned and disappeared from sight, leaving the Marquis alone with his thoughts. A maid named Tempo was walking from corner to corner and didn't know what to do. She saw Iran asked where she had been. The head of a maid told her that she had gone to get flowers. The protagonist asked what had happened and why was her subordinate so anxious. Tempo replied that was her in a palace. There was a divine avatar there. Mr. Theo sat in a chair and asked what Sophie had come for. The girl answered that it seemed to her that they had not said goodbye properly at the ceremony. She needed to see the prince. She wanted to have a conversation with him. The editor asked that he not like the fact that she visited the protagonist at that moment. It didn't matter whether he liked it or not. Sancha asked what he thought about the farewell ceremony. She was embarrassed to talk about it, but she really wanted to establish a relationship with His Highness. The divine avatar began her story almost immediately after graduating from the academy. She joined the temple. Outside of the temple, she was no different from the other girls, but in the church itself she held a lowly position, so she was treated poorly. On one of these hard days, Sanja didn't have time to speak before she was shouted at to be careful. Something flew at her, and she covered her face with her hand. It wouldn't have helped him much if Her Majesty hadn't stood in front of her. It completely covered his avatar. They were told that guy who accidentally threw the ball that he had completely lost his mind. And you can't forget people like that. The young man apologized and asked if they were okay. The girl continued her story and said that few appeared one hard day, and ever since then this gentleman had been a special person to help. She was his divine Nevada, which meant that Sonia was also a special person to him, and as she tried her best, the guy would notice her. His Highness was neither cold nor hot on this information. He asked if she had come just to tell him that. Sophie replied that no, she had come to see His Majesty. She must have wanted to meet the king, but it was kind of strange. Someone knocked on the door. The protagonist allowed someone to come in. It was Irene who came in and brought tea. Theo told his divine avatar that the emperor wanted him to marry this girl, but he didn't need to. And Sonia could count on nothing, not at all. The prince said that if they had discussed everything, it was time for Miss Dale to go. He was very busy and announced that he would speak to His Majesty himself. The divine avatar said that in that case she would go, but she could not command to heart what and whom to feel for. The girl cried. The main character who was in the room thought about the fact that the divine avatar wanted to be with Prince Theo, and when tears began to flow from her eyes, Aaron remembered herself in the same state a few days ago. The head maid looked at Sophie's footsteps and thought to herself, how could she find happiness? His Highness was drinking tea and turned to his beloved. He asked if everything was all right. It seemed to him that his personal servants were not in the mood. The girl replied in the negative to this and took a tray of plates and cups to carry them away. The guy saw that something was wrong. He took the tray from the girl and asked was she worried about him being with Sonia. He took her hand and kissed her wrist. Then he said they had somewhere to go. Was Irene really jealous of him? He kissed her hand further and talked about not marrying her. The protagonist replied that she was indeed jealous of him because the fatter lady had come. But the strange thing was that she understood and imagined how this girl felt. The head maid was happy that Prince elect her. But then why was she worried? The guy took her in his arms and told her that he belonged only to her. They were drowning in each other's eyes. They didn't need anyone else. They had enough of each other's company. These were too serious things for a guy to say for nothing. She promised she wouldn't worry anymore, and after those words, their lips came together in a kiss. Prince Theo went to see his father, the king. The man asked what his son was doing there. The boy said that the man probably already knew about the strange rumors going around the palace about the fact that he was going to get married. The protagonists knew that they had been spread by the emperor's subordinates. They are repeated to him again that he would not marry this girl, even though she was his divine avatar, the king said to his son. But he had to be grateful that he had his avatar. After all, he lived because of him, and it was only because of him that the young man could do as he pleased. The emperor stated the fact that it was better to marry Divina Vitor and added that the prince understood this perfectly well. To the protagonist asked his father if he really wanted Mr. to marry Sony so badly. It was true. That was all the king had asked for. Thing I began to tell His Majesty that when Mum died, he took care of his children with all the love he had. The king heard the prediction that the prince would die, and he knows how hard it was for his father because of that. But the protagonists didn't want that. The emperor didn't understand why his son was so stubborn. Sure, maybe earlier the young man would have agreed, but he now had Irene, who filled his life with light, and he couldn't do that to her. Mr. Theo said that he already had a lover. The emperor was shocked by such news and asked who was this girl. The protagonist didn't say who it was. He had to keep it a secret for a while, but he had already made his promise, and in the future he will definitely introduce his father to his girlfriend. Since the prince didn't want it so badly, the king couldn't force the marriage on him. He understood his son, thanked him, and told him to have the emperor tell the church that he disagreed with a decision. Because of the prince, the man became very often nervous, and it was all he could accomplish. He was very curious, who was fierce lover. Money stood by the princess' carriage, and as soon as he got out, she asked him how the conversation had gone. The boy replied that the main thing was that it had taken place. The protagonist turns sharply to the assistant and asked what she thought about their wedding with Iran. Money asked if the boy had told everything to the emperor. He answered in the negative and said that he didn't know how his father would react when he found out who Irene was. Wouldn't it make her life harder? Anything was possible. The protagonists realized that the king could have kicked her out. The aristocrats, likewise, could interfere. Not everyone was at the same opinion as His Highness. That was true. Maybe he could talk his father into it. At least he hoped so. But could the young people get married if the aristocracy was against it? Irene had just opened her heart to Prince Theo, and the problems kept coming and coming. He didn't think there would be so many problems because of the difference in status, Monet said. There seemed to be a way to solve this problem. Irene was special. Recently His Highness of Assistant had seen her praying, and during that, she didn't have time to finish because the main character interrupted her because someone was bothering him. The guy explained that he would listen to the girl. A little later there was that puppy again, Marquez Telford. He had been on the prince's radar too often lately. He was starting to get angry about it. They didn't realize where he was going, but then they realized that Hales was on his way to Irene. Mr. Theo didn't understand why he was always hanging around the protagonist. Monet advised him to find out from the young man. His Highness said he wouldn't do that the moment and it was necessary to follow this man. The guy was a trickster and the protagonist decided to see how he would behave next to Irene and then everything would fall into place. The Marquis approached the girl and called her by name. She was surprised at such a meeting. The guide asked how she was doing. She answered that everything was as usual. Hale said that the flower the protagonist gave him the day before was adorable, just like her. The head maid was a little shocked that the young man had placed at his place. Now the marvelous rose stood in his office. It seemed to Iran that the markets did not like the flowers. He answered her that he could not afford to throw away what was her gift. The protagonist told her acquaintance that she had tried propagating flowers by cuttings. It was a way of having to plant branches of plants again. Mr. Hales leaned over to the girl and asked what was that flower in her hands. He was too close to her and it was stressing her out, to say the least. The protagonists, so Monet. Approaching them along with Prince Theo, the Marquis greeted the young men. The protagonist told Irang that he had a meeting in half an hour. He asked her to prepare everything he needed. In the meantime, he wanted to talk to the Marquis. They clearly had something to discuss. She understood it and went to do the prince's errand. Mr. Theo turned to the Marquis and said that he was coming too often to his palace. And he wasn't there for the boy. He seemed to be infatuated with his Highness's maid. He replied that that was indeed the case. But it was not the kind of interest the protagonist was thinking of. The prince asked the young man what interest he was talking about then. Hales replied that Phil meant the interest he himself had in Irene. Mr. Theo said that their conversation would probably go very quickly. He ordered him to stop hanging around Irene. The Marquis replied to his Highness that he had misunderstood everything. He didn't like the head of the servants, but that the young man could care less. If Mr. was not flirting with me, then what was the name of what he was doing? The boy replied that he just wanted to get to know the real protagonist. The prince didn't understand what the conversation was about. Monet stood by and thought about the fact that did the Marquis really know everything? And fear food about the fact that Hales were saying the same thing that Basil had said. He wondered what these men meant. Mr. Tilford replied that if the prince didn't understand what the story was about, he had no right to tell it. The protagonist was already furious. It seemed to him that he was decided to be bullied in this way. The guy didn't understand why no one could explain it to him. Wait was Marquis apologized and said that it was just that the information was unconfirmed and it was for that reason that he couldn't state anything. He asked to be excused. The boy thought about how he would be glad that Aaron would turn out to be a divine avatar. But he had to realize it himself before he put the royal house on notice. If he rushed it, he would be destroyed not only by his family but by the church as well. And he didn't want him at faultlessly. Mr. Theo was furious and hit the wall in the palace with his fist in order to relieve the tension. He told Monet he would die of shame. Both Basil and that idiot Hales suspected Irene of something, but the protagonist didn't realize what. Monet announced that she needed to talk to his Highness about something. He said his head was full and if it wasn't important, it didn't need to be told. IS assistant said they needed to talk about it that very minute. The guy asked what the conversation was going to be about and started listening to her. First, she wanted to apologize. The girl said she couldn't believe it herself, but she had something to say about the fact that the markets had doubted Irene for a reason. Monet knew what the man was talking about. The gentleman's assistant was trying to figure out what kind of person Irene was. They asked what was it even for the lady of the fair. Sachs said that it all happened at the farewell ceremony. Monet looked into the temple and so I ran at prayer time and then it was as if butterflies were flying around her. And there was a lot of light around Theo's beloved. It was like a miracle, like a sign of revelation. Basil told her how this sign manifested itself. The light that surrounded the main character was very similar to what Basil described. Mr. Theo asked if the Marquis was there and if he had seen Iran during the prayer. Coin could not answer this question with certainty. However, judging from what the young man said, it seemed that he had. Now everything became clear to the protagonist. The guy realized why he was always hanging around his girlfriend. He decided to get close to her after seeing a sign of revelation. But why did that light appear? It seems like Irene was praying at that moment. That was clearly not considered normal. Could it be that Aaron was? No. It was still too early to tell. Basil said that the main character was acting suspiciously. Mana confirmed it and said he even wrote to her about it in a letter. Maybe it was necessary to ask him to. The prince's assistant saw that something was bothering him, so she inquired as to what exactly it was. Basil suspected Irene of being a spy for the church. As she found out, she would be very hurt. There was no way to let him know how things really were. They would tell everything when they were sure of it. What was important was that such phenomena were very unusual, for you thought about the fact that the Marquez was in on everything. He didn't like the fact that he was the last to know about everything. Okay, that was enough. Now the prince understood everything. There was no way he would miss the next opportunity. Irene was afraid that the situation would only get worse. She hoped that the guy's conversation had gone well, especially since no news had been heard. But that didn't reassure the girl in any way. She was still very worried. What if they thought it would all be on her conscience? She realized that she needed to calm down and she told herself that everything was fine. Maybe she should have overheard them talking in the first place, but that would have been really weird. She hadn't done anything wrong. But she felt disgusted. The main character liked the prince, and she did not want to lose him because of some misunderstanding. Sophie stood in front of the girl. She came back. Lady Dale apologized. Irene asked what she could have used to the girl. As expected, the divine avatar wanted to meet Prince Theo at that very second. Sunny. I asked the head of the maidservants where her boss was. The protagonist answered her that his highness was busy. He was having a meeting. She didn't understand what she should do. She and Sonia were alone in the room. She didn't feel comfortable about it. The avatar wondered if maybe the prince was just avoiding her. The head of the maidservants replied that was absolutely not the case. But she personally wouldn't want to date the girl. Sophie said they could wait for him together. Aaron thought about what she now saw the divine avatar and realized that even if the prince liked her, he would not marry. A commoner's earlier suggested that Mr. Theo's servant talked to her. The protagonist replied that it would be best to escort her to His Highness's study. Her thoughts were preoccupied with the fact that even if the prince liked her a lot, he could still marry her. She didn't understand why she was leading her to her lover. It was so stupid. And why had Sophie come that day in the first place, when the prince had chased her away? She had declared that she couldn't take no for an answer. What was she going to say to the Lord again? The protagonist led the divine avatar to Theo's office and told her to wait for him. The girl thanked her politely. She remembered and asked if Irene had brought tea last time. The girl was surprised that she had been remembered, Lady Dale said. It could not have been otherwise for many things that happened that day. Sophie said that she was sorry that she could not taste the tea that the head of the servants had prepared. The girl started drinking the tea and concluded that it had a wonderful flavor. Irene modestly thanked the one. The main character was still in shock that she was remembered by the princess. Divine Avatar Miss Dale inquired if it was true that the fair sexes stood before her. Was His Highness's closest servant? Irene answered in the affirmative to the question. So MIA concluded that she knew the Lord well and wanted to ask something. The Avatar asked what His Highness liked. She was curious to know the main character's preferences. It was a hard question for Irene. She had never really thought about it. It was easier for her to say what His Highness didn't like than what he liked. The main character replied to Sophie that the prince seemed to like tea. The head of the servants really liked Theo and she didn't even know about his favorite things and preferences. It seemed to her that the feelings for the prince on her part were not that strong. And the guys? Divine Avatar was attentive to every little detail. Irene said she would go find out how long the meeting would last. To be completely frank, the protagonist even envied Sophie. This girl was not shy about her curiosity and she and His Majesty were from completely different worlds and the difference in their state chooses was unacceptable. For that time, she was walking down the hallway and thinking about it. Someone took her around the waist and pulled her to him. Of course, it was His Highness Theo that I already knew what his beloved was going to say, and well ahead of her. Explained for the meeting was long over and no one was in the office, which meant that no one would see them for sure and she could not worry about that. The prince asked if Irene wanted to go somewhere else. The protagonist stepped back to the door, but the guy held out his hands to her and told her to go to him. The young man asked what his girlfriend had been doing during the day. She lied and said it was nothing new. He picked her up and put her on his lap. Aaron thought about the fact that His Highness Theo should have been warned that Mrs. Summerdale was expecting him. But she somehow didn't even have the tongue to do so. The master asked the head maid if there was anything she didn't want to tell him. Maybe the divine avatar had offended her. The protagonist replied that they hardly ever talked to each other. Theo pressed his girlfriend even tighter against his hot body and said that he probably didn't know much about his personal maid yet. The girl asked why the man thought that his answer was simple. It was because he liked Irene, that was the whole reason. She said she would like to get to know the guy better, too. She inquired about the reason his hand had ventured below the appropriate threshold. They responded by expressing his desire to make physical contact with her, a mischievous grin adorning his face as his hand caressed his partner's posterior. Gradually, he started breathing against the girl's neck. Although he could have taken things further, he refrained from doing so. Recognizing that this was not an opportunity time for intimate relations between lovers, His Highness asked if his beloved didn't like all this and added that she was heartless. Irene liked everything, just the protagonist took the girl by her beautiful face. And said that they could have done it all that minute. The head of his servants. That was impossible to do it after all. The divine avatar was looking for him and was waiting for him in his office. At that moment, Prince Theo immediately changed his face and asked why Stony had come. As personal servants said Lady Dale wanted to see him and say something. The boy concluded that she was very stubborn. He had thought they had finished all discussion with her and would not return to it. Sophie Dale had no intention of backing down from His Highness. She clearly had intentions to win this guy over. Theo said that he had already talked to the king. Iran didn't know this news. He announced at him that he wasn't marrying his Divina Vota. And that he already had a girl who had his heart set on her. After these words, the prince kissed the hand of the protagonist. The lady asked if he had really told His Majesty that. The answer of the protagonist was in the affirmative. And also he added that his father was aware of all the events. He would never marry Sophie, no matter how it was. The young man hugged the girl and once again repeated the fact that he was only hers and she conquered his heart. His body belonged to this servant too. He was all but hers. The protagonist explained that there was indeed a divine avatar waiting for him. Few asked his personal servant why she let her in. But Irene wouldn't be able to point anything out to her. The girl was not in the right position, nor with the social status to give commands. The young man simply agreed with her. His Highness wanted to speak to Sophie again. He wanted to tell her what he had told his father. He took the head of the servants by the hand and led the way. As soon as one was resolved, someone else appeared. The girl didn't understand what the conversation was about, with whom and what was being decided. The divine avatar Sonia sat in the prince's office waiting for him and sipping tea. She was lost in speculation as to when His Majesty would come to see her, and he entered the room. At that moment, without greeting, he went straight to the subject. He said that he thought they had already broached the subject. Behind his back stood Irene, and they were holding hands. Sonia Dale greeted His Highness the Prince and said she was glad to see them. She saw the couple holding hands. The head of the servants tried to pull the hand out, but the guy took her hand again and didn't let go of his grip again. They said that apparently the church never understood anything. The divine avatar didn't understand what the prince was talking about or pretended to. The young man announced that their wedding would not take place, and he had already informed even His Majesty the Emperor about it. He already had a girlfriend he loved, so from that moment on he ordered the avatar not to get in his way anymore. I even listened to all of this and wondered more and more at that moment. Theo added that Sophie didn't have to look for him anymore and wait to meet him. The girl was hurt by this and she stated the fact that the prince was ruthless towards her and her feelings. He probably thought the avatar was a nuisance and she asked His Majesty would allow Theo to be with Iran, a prince and a commoner. It's not even conceivable. It was probably not the kind of lover the king saw with his son. So he thought she didn't have to worry about them, and it turned out that the young man wasn't even going to marry her. The prince didn't want this marriage. He wanted to be with someone else. The young man's divine avatar told him to think about his relationship with the church. She advised His Highness to think of the consequences, but he didn't need it at all. The protagonist did not consider her opinion. And the girl's advice had no effect on his choice. Apparently no wanted to continue bullying Prince Beer with the church, but the Lord wouldn't end their relationship that hadn't even begun. It was their last meeting. So he wasn't going to give up and told the man that they were bound by fate. And he was well aware of this fact. After all, she was his divine voter. The girl added that the one had to rely on God in order to remain a strong man. The protagonist replied to her that Lady Dale could use the title of divine avatar as much as her soul desired. There would not limit her powers which involved the church, however. They would not marry under any circumstances. Sophie said that was ridiculous. He was a wise man after all and had saved her life. The marriage could not fail. He apologized to her and started walking away with his beloved. The avatar told him that he would regret that decision. Irene and Theo were alone in the room and the girl asked if he'd been okay. The representative of the stronger sex asked a counter question that he handled that divine avatar. The protagonist replied that quite well and it was a good job. In fact, the head of the servants was very worried. After all, this could lead to discord between the imperial family and the church. His Highness the Prince noticed that there was still something wrong and asked if his beloved was still thinking about all this. She replied that she had not, but it seemed to her that it was all serious. The young man pressed her head against his chest and said that he would have done it anyway. He was willing to do anything to make Iran feel happy and loved by the prince's side. It was important to him that she lived in peace. The main heroine pressed her nose into the chest of her beloved, and it was very pleasant and important for her to hear these words. She felt calm and protected next to his majesty. The prince's personal servant replied that she had enough of his love and then covered his lips with her own. The young people lay in bed without clothes, and Theo told his beloved that he would never marry Sophie. He even already had a suitor for this girl. It already seemed together in his head, the mark. We sat at the table and looked at the rose Irene had given him. He was having a rhetorical conversation with himself. The girl didn't know what she had done with this guy yet. The protagonists were lying together in bed. Anthea asked if he had bought the head of the maid with his kisses. She wanted to answer, but she was at a loss for words. It pleased the princess' ego. It had been a long time since he had done this to his beloved. The young man was always trying to persuade Iran, but now it would be as he wanted it to be. The young man asked his beloved, as she knew what she had to do first. She had no idea his highness told her that first she had to stop communicating with Marquez Hales. But the head maid didn't understand. As a maid, how could she refuse such an important man? They said that it was enough that the protagonist would tell him that she did not want to communicate with him. Irene replied that it wasn't that simple. A master told her to make an excuse. The girl turned to him and replied that she didn't know how to present such news to the young man. The protagonist didn't like the fact that his girlfriend was socializing with some male member other than him. He asked if she would do it for him. His Majesty the Prince no longer wished to see them together. This person kept flirting with her and it was really stressing the young man out well. The Lord had convinced his personal servant of this and the one decided that she had to be ready for it. Aaron didn't understand why the Marquez was being so nice and polite to her, but she didn't want to make Prince Theo nervous. Besides, it couldn't be that the head of the servants liked the Mark ways. After all, he surely knew that she was already occupied by the protagonist. The fair sex decided the very next day to tell Mr. Hales everything, but she didn't know how to do it without offending the guy. She was sitting on a bench when suddenly Hales came up to her and greeted her. She didn't forget her manners and it the same in return. That day was just great. The two of them noticed that the Mr. noticed that something was wrong and asked the head of the maid's office about it. Mr. Monsoon noticed that something was wrong and asked the head of the maid service about it. She was a little different that day that she had always been. There was something different about her, and it was noticeable, but the Marquis could not understand what it was. At that moment it seemed to the representative of the stronger sex, but the protagonist was waiting for him on the bench and it was not a chance meeting. And because of this, the guy admitted that he was also a little excited Last I rang to tell the whole truth, whatever it takes. The girl decided that this was the peak moment. She said that Hales was right about that. She did want to tell him something. Monkey said he knew she did and tried to guess. He assumed that he liked the head of the servants. Irene told him that wasn't the case. She already had someone who had won her heart and she felt a sense of sympathy for him. She said the Marquis himself knew who it was. The representative of Essex wanted to continue, but at one point she stammered and said that the guy misunderstood everything and asked him to forget about everything. Irene stalled, but he wanted to see her because she certainly realized the Marquis didn't like her in that way. The tales say that if he was attracted to her, he was not allowed to come there anymore. At that moment he moved closer to the imperial palace servant. There was an impermissibly small distance between them. The main character talked to Theo about getting up the courage to tell the Mark was everything. A boyfriend agreed. But then he asked her what she would do if this man really felt sympathy for her. The head of the maid said that she would simply not reciprocate because the heart only belonged to the prince. Marquez had told Irene that she was wonderful, but she didn't have to worry about him having any romantic feelings for a female member of the female sex. Or maybe she was just embarrassed to admit that the girl wanted the Marquis to like her. The protagonist stopped the guy's mental stream and said that it wasn't true and he misunderstood everything. Irene was one of the few people Hales socialized with, so we hope she was enjoying being around him. The boy got up from the bench where he and the head of the servants were sitting and said he would go before Prince Theo got it wrong again. The girl thanked him for listening to her. The Markley said it had cost him nothing. The head of the servants looked after the boy and wondered if he was the Markles, walked and started talking to himself. He thought he knew how to lie. There was no time to despondent. There was still a lot for the lad to do. He had to come to his senses now. Aaron needed to talk to his highness. He'd been a bit stiff lately. Now the girl hoped that her lover's jealousy would pass. She entered the main character's office but didn't see him at his desk. He was sitting in a chair and seemed to have fallen asleep. He jolted awake and with a grin asked her if she enjoyed watching him sleep so much she didn't expect that and freaked out. Theo said jokingly that she could have fallen from such a shock. The prince asked who had allowed her to touch him like that. The representative of the fair sex did not understand what she did since her boyfriend had suspicions about her. Like that she's done it before and now what? She was probably going to kiss. His Highness Irene apologized for waking the boy up the other day when she started touching him. Prince Theo replied that it was a bit of a misunderstanding and he woke up. Then when the girl he loved walked into his office, the protagonist asked why. In such a case, the young man did not even move. He replied that he was just little tired. The first thing that gentleman wanted to see when he opened his eyes was his favorite person, and so he did. Irene advised to rest some more if he was tired, but he just got up to hug his beloved and said that he was fine. The protagonist replied that he would feel even better when the young man knew what she wanted to tell him. He was very curious as to what news his personal servant had brought him. She began to tell him that just a few minutes ago, she had told the monkeys that she already had a favorite man. His Highness Theo said that meant he had tortured her well during the night. After that he asked how Market's Hales reacted to such news. Iran said that the guy replied to her that he already knew everything. There was some strange feeling after saying goodbye to him. It was quite unexpected for His Highness. He thought it was a young man. It would be more persistent. The protagonist wanted to ask. By her lover thought so, but he just pulled her to him and kissed her. He said that he loved Irene very much and thought. But the Marquis had the same feelings towards the fair sex. But the king's son was very glad that Hales had given up so quickly. He once again drew his beloved in for a kiss. He had very strong feelings. Person Basil knocked on His Highness of Chambers and introduced himself. He asked permission to enter. There was in the ring with Irene and told his assistant to come in later. At this moment he was covering the girl's mouth with his hand so she wouldn't bother anything. The young man inquired as to what the prince was doing there. He replied with a smile on his face that he had a guest. The protagonist thought about whether the guy had left. His Highness began to kiss her and the girl asked him to wait, but the prince replied that there was no time to wait. But Basil hadn't left yet. The prince knew that, but he didn't care. He asked Irene where she wanted to hide. He joked, and then just said he would go first so she could take a time. The head maid of the imperial palace decided that she would leave the princess room later. Do as he told her. After all, as she ran into Basil, it would be very awkward for now. She needed to spread everything out on the table, otherwise it would be a real mess. The protagonist's a Word document with a picture on it. She did not understand why it was written about her. There was much more information written than what she turned in when she sent to get a job. Irene's folder biography was written there. It was night. The head of the maid was in a room that was stacked with various books, folders, and so on. The papers you found in theater room were definitely not the ones she filed. Have the protagonist collected everything about his favorite girl's past, but why did he need it? Maybe treated his personal servant with suspicion. The representative of their sex did not understand what she did since her boyfriend had suspicions about her. Even what she said about her family was written in detail. She had so many questions for His Highness Theo. He has so much about everything. Including what she said about her family was written in detail. She had so many questions for His Highness Theo, so that was why the guy was asking her so much about everything. Now the puzzle in the maid's mind was coming together. Did the man want to see if she was lying to him? The prince was due back in the study soon. She needed to put everything back and figure out what to do next. Irene didn't understand what her reaction to this was supposed to be. Maybe it was better to pretend she didn't know or see anything. Well, that is what we know so far from this manhwa. Will His Highness the Prince have a valid reason for storing so much invasive and personal details of Irene without her knowledge? Or will he brush it off as part of his royal right if he is to take the relationship further? What about you? Would you be okay with this if you were in Irene's position? Stay tuned for the continuation and type Irene in the comments section if you want the next parts. In the meantime, here is an exciting story as promised. This manhwa starts off with a beautiful fair MC with pink hair cascading to her slender waist as she sits. Her name is Elinika and she is a relatively minor character. This story is from her point of view, and is set in the imperial land of Velga. As she narrates the story and is a minor character and part-time princess who is currently being held hostage by the great state of Velga. The princess is now eagerly awaiting the emperor of Velgar. When the emperor appeared to Elinika, she was very happy to see him, but once again she accidentally misspoke and called him father. The princess was lucky and the ruler didn't get angry. Elinika quickly turned the conversation around and asked the emperor if he would marry her. The ruler calmly replied that he had not kidnapped her to marry her. The girl knew that this was exactly what would happen, and then the lord asked her why she was asking for marriage as she knew the answer beforehand. The princess did not know what to answer, but quickly pulled himself together and said that she loved his majesty and it was love at first sight. The ruler refused the confession. Elinika reminded Atlantic Ad that he has a fiancé. The princess was not confused and said that that girl did not yet have the opportunity to be called the emperor's bride. The ruler said that he would fix it in the future. Elinika with a wide smiling face said that the ruler's future was still uncertain. Asked if he loved Lady Alad, the emperor explained that he felt nothing in the direction of his bride to be yet, and Elinika immediately asked. She stood a chance in such a case. The overlord looking down at the girl also questioned why he should give such an opportunity to the princess. The girl looked at him embarrassed and asked him if he liked her, to which he said no. The princess was angry because she didn't understand the emperor's logic. Elinika began to say that if the ruler married her, he would have many more opportunities. And from his marriage to the lady, the ruler looked at the girl with interest and asked what these. The princess named 3 benefits of marrying her reapers of Libya, which were blessed by the goddess, a large dowry which will be taken care of by the girl's father as she is the youngest and sweetest of his daughters, the Glucomen Road, which is an important site for the kingdom. However, the emperor was able to find a counter-argument every argument and rejected all of Atlantic's proposals. The ruler won the argument. And here the girl regretted that her state was very small. At this moment the princess indignantly thinks that his majesty knew the real reason for such actions of Elinika. He would accept her proposal because she is trying to save him. The princess knows that there will be bad consequences because of the emperor and Lady Ella's marriage. First they will have a horrible villain and the lady will raise him to be a dark mage and afterward the child will kill his father. The emperor before his 40th birthday. Elenica thinks about what might happen as she told the ruler, but concludes that he would either want to know the source or think she's crazy. Eventually, the princess decides to use the technique she didn't want to and directly ask the overlord if she is beautiful, to which he replies that he doesn't know a lady. Go feels indignation at the emperor's response. The ruler confessed that it was the first time he had received such a proposal. But he decided to put the matter finally to rest and told the girl that he would not marry her. But he did not want a loveless marriage. The princess is shocked, and afterward he says that as soon as the Blue Common Road is opened, he will send the girl home immediately. At this point the emperor ends the conversation and leaves the girl thinks in anger that even if the ruler has erected an impregnable fortress around him, it won't stop her because she has a definite reason to cling so desperately. Elenica, or rather the girl who is in the body of the princess after her death in the real world, got into the novel 20 years before the main events and now must prevent the birth of the main villain as well as the subsequent misfortunes that will fall on the main characters. In parallel with the main events, the heroine must also help yourself cause their life may last only 5 years due to an overbundles of mana in her body, the only person who can help. This is your Ed and a descendant of the Golden Current member of Belga. Here Elenica is frustrated to think that all her attempts as a minor heroine to help yourself and your Ed and have failed because of the emperor's humiliating refusal. A short time later, Elenica is chatting in the garden with a beautiful redhead lady about what she and her husband want to name their future child. The girl, blushing slightly, replies that they give her the name Breezney. The princess says it's a wonderful name, but the scarlet-haired girl isn't so sure about it and asked about whether the name is more appropriate for a pet. Elenica denies the girl's assumption while discussing the baby's name, a situation formed in Atlantic's mind. This is the world of the short story. Brittany wants to be happy, which is exactly what the girl was reading before her death. Brasilia is Elenica's older sister. And it is she who is now carrying the main character of the story under her heart. About 8 months ago a girl woke up in the princess body. She was not prepared for such a change and screamed in fright. After a little bit of shock she began to look at her new body, noting that her skin was whiter than snow, the highlight pink and soft as cotton candy, and her incredible blue eyes. The girl was enchanting. The girl in the princess's body realized she was speaking in a language that was unfamiliar to her. The Provident couldn't wonderful long about her new position because the princess' older sister Isabella burst into the room. The older sister came running to the younger when she heard her scream. I was surprised when Yonis to say Villa had addressed her affectionately, answered her in a polite manner. The girl in Atlantic's body was surprised to see girls in maid costumes. Adonga could not admit who she was and where she came from. She herself did not fully understand what was going on, and so she made everyone think that she was still Princess Elenica who lost her memory, and because of this there was a commotion in the kingdom. The king and queen also came to see their daughter to see if perhaps she remembered at least them. Elenica was surprised by such care and did not hold back her emotions. Here the heroine recalls how she died in her world as the princess was in her thoughts, a young lad. Room, who introduced himself as Fun Disc Audio and said that he had been assigned as her personal god. The princess was surprised to hear how God's name and asked him to repeat it. His last name seemed vaguely familiar, and when she remembered where she had heard it, she was stumped. She could not believe it, but in front of her stood the hero of the novel she had read before she died. The princess asked if Fernandez had a brother or a son, and he replied that he did not. It was at this point that Lanica realized she was in another 20 years before the key events. The guard inquired if the princess was all right, and without the girl came to her senses. Atlantica remembered that the novel begins when her older pregnant sister, the savior, is kidnapped, and sadly she realized that she was now in the Provar story. The princess thinks the situation she finds herself in is senseless and absurd. Elenica tells us that Belkirk is a huge empire and the strongest country in the striker which could destroy the kingdom of Abovni at any moment. It was the Emperor Eurydion who kidnapped the savior. The princess is frightened to think of the ruler as the real scandal who unexpectedly attacked, kidnapped, and subsequently imprisoned her older sister, but also a learning curve reflects on the fact that if one gets to know Bullet come up OC, one realizes that he is very unhappy. Who is facing a tragic death? The girl in Elenik's body recalls that when she read the moment of the ruler's death in the novel, she cried very hard. Maiden wants to understand the reason why she fears the emperor. Either because he is the lord of the empire or because he is no longer just a character in a novel, but a real person to her. The kidnapping of the older sister was not only the problem of the story, but also the beginning of the tragic events that happened to the parents of the main characters. The story Brittany Wants to Be Happy tells the story of a passionate and unusual love between Princess Brittany and her guard Alexia. There are 3 main characters in this novel. The main character is the first princess of Abovni, the CD's daughter Brittany, and the main character is Brittany's guard Alexia. Also the main villain is Tyrant Emperor Bel, Garth, Darkar, Belga. The story is also about how the main characters help each other heal the traumas of childhood and repair the tragedies of the past. After all, it comes out that neither of the main characters' parents had a happy and peaceful life. Elenico recalls that the main character's parents passed away early in life and it was his alias kidnapping that was the impetus for all the sad events that followed. Elenica tells which are the main character's parents and under what circumstances will suffer or die. The first to pass away is Brittany's father Duke Lebanon. He went to rescue his pregnant wife from imprisonment but died on the battlefield. Mercia, it was in captivity, learned of her husband's death and in great shock, a birth to a daughter a little before her due date. After these events, the kingdom of Abovni and the empire of Belgas never made a truce, and it was only after such a long stretch of time that Asialia and middle Brittany, now 10 years old, were able to make their way home. Because Brittany left the empire, little Prince Darkar began to feel bitterness of Lawson. Elenica couldn't remember Deccan Valgus' middle name because it was too long. But Elinico remembered exactly that this child had become a villain who could control the souls of hell. And it was after Brittany's departure that 11-year-old Dekov sacrificed his father Iridian to black magic because he himself wanted to become emperor. And of all the kingdom of Abovni where Brittany was located 2 years after returning home, these died of a contagious disease. And they had already been 3 accidents. But a little while later, Atlantica remembered another incident. The father of the third main character, Anne, the Princess Guard Fernandez, lost a leg and an eye during the War Atlantic and knows that the main character's parents are doomed to an unhappy life. But she's sure the original story was about the healing power of youth and sweet love. The girl in Ella Nikki's body thinks that if this story is the same as in the novel, everyone will have a very sad ending. The pregnant is Eddie's belly is living proof of that. The girl recalls that she did not initially accept what was happening as reality. She thought maybe it was a dream, or she was in a coma after the accident, or she was stolen by aliens altogether. But now it's his second life and given to Cv's long gestation period. Belga is about to invade the moment to say Villa asked what Lineker was thinking about. The goal came out of her thoughts, the older sister said. The younger one looked amused. Elinica reacted and said she was looking forward to the arrival of baby Brittany. The girl in the body of the younger princess realized that she could no longer stand Italy by and began to think of a plan of action, how to prevent all the terrible events in the future. Because she knew the plot of the novel, Elinica began to ponder the reasons the Valgus attack on the bunny, but from the first line I didn't know what to write. Because in the original work, the history of the parents of the characters was not revealed in detail. The only reason she could remember was that the above knee had refused to follow the agreement and Emperor Bogus' natural reaction to that was anger and rage. Itil Annika could not remember the very essence of the treaty as the princess was thinking of her god. Fernandez approached her and inquired about her well-being and Lanica looked at him thoughtfully and without thinking, answered that she feared for his left eye and right leg. Of course, Fernandez did not understand what she meant. The princess quickly corrected herself and told him to ignore it afterward. Yeah, he asked Birdie if he knew anything about the agreement between the Bosnian Belgot. Fernandez responded that he knew what it was about, and it turned out to be the Glucomen-Roe tripartite agreement after what he said the girl asked for. More details. This agreement further explained that the treaty is that the kingdom of Laboni opens Flucomen and the Bogus Empire transports itself mana stones from a sick. In an epiphany came over the girl and she remembered that when there was a moment in the novel about this pact, she had gotten out of it and not read that part. The princess interrogated had died about the treaty, but he tried to zero in on the subject. After that he started to ask in response by his daughter needed this information and it started to irritate Anna Nicola little. Her father looked tense, so the princess asked him if he was up to something strange. The king turned to his daughter with a desperate expression on his face, and Annika was horrified, but she realized that things were bad 3 hours later. The princess was able to get the king to talk and he told her that he had closed this road 2 years ago. It is told here that Belgas was originally a country without mana stones. But since these stones were vital to the defense of the palace and the borders of the empire, Belgos made a trade treaty with Azikan which has deposits of mana stones. As a result Belgo which is to the east was given permission by the kingdom of Above-Ni, in whose territory Kuperman is located. They use the road as the shortest route to a stake in the west. Huge reserves of mana stones have recently been discovered in Azikan and trade activity between the two countries has skyrocketed and when it did greed took over the king of Above-Ni, he decided to change some of the terms of the contract. In this case the use of the Blue Kaiman road would not cost a fixed number of stones, but 10% of the total supply. Alanik was shocked by what she heard and wondered if her father was an outlaw. For the last 50 years the king had been getting 100 stones for shipment and then he demanded 1,000. Without even discussing it with the other parties, the girl questioned the king about whether he feared retaliation from the empire, first arbitrarily changing the terms of the agreement and then closing the road. For 2 years, the king confidently said that although Belgium was a very strong state, there was no need to worry because the Rockers Peace Treaty had been made so the empire would not harm the kingdom. The girl irritated. He reports that the king has undermined the patience of Algo, who was keeping peace on the continent, after which the princess asked if the king was going to open the road at all. He nonchalantly said he had no reason to do so. A while later, the princess was on a walk with her older sister and was tensely thinking about the fact that she had not yet begun to understand the situation, but had already lost his Elia. Noticing how younger sister's dejected state asked what she was worrying about, Elinica a little nervously replied that everything was fine. The older one didn't believe her and immediately told her that if the younger one had a problem she could share everything and that she would always help her naturally. Yeah, he didn't want to make it as easy and nervous and smiled sweetly. She thought that her older sister was a real angel. Elenico responded by saying that she would also protect the sea villa in case of danger. Since the first time to prevent war failed behind us came up with another to prevent the CBI from being kidnapped by the emperor of *************. That said, the princess realized that she didn't know the exact date of Belgas attack. After a while any cat traveled to the Duchy of Lebanon to her sister's husband's younger brother Sergei Levin, who is also the princess's best friend Sodir, approached Elinica for leaving the palace for nothing. After that the princess and the duke started teasing each other. The princess has arrived at the duchy in order to keep her sister from being captured at the right moment, because in the original mobilization this is the place that will be attacked. So said that any card was still the same as before, only now even more out of control. The duke continues to approach the princess, only now with the fact that because of a temper, no one will see her as a princess. The princess jokingly asked Saudi to shut up. At this point, the girl you in the real world she would not have fit through any goes past, but read it carefully. So she asks Elinica if she really had something going on. The girl looking at him confidently nods affirmatively. She tells him that the right moment he must come and save her, so it confused the ask why it has to be him, since the princess has Sir Cardio Eleni, gas smoking, says he'll run to save for himself in the original, this novella. That's what happened. So he was holding America when her older sister was surrounded by imperial soldiers. The princess thinks about the fact that she will have to take out the Severe beforehand and afterward hide in a safe place in case something goes wrong. She can only rely on Sergei. Anika voices are forced to surge, saying that only he is the only one she can trust and that he will have to come at the agreed time. Surge response to these words of the girl that she says strange things. At that moment, Elinica didn't think about the emperor's goals at all, and also that in the kingdom of Above-Ni, it's not just the older sister who holds the title of princess. Some time passed and the sisters were chatting again over a cup of tea. Azialia said that the physician had come to examine her and said there was nothing to worry about. Elinica was glad to hear this, but at this moment she was in thought. She couldn't understand what it was that had been bothering her for the past even though everyone around I was calm. Alanic, I was on pins and needles. At one point she jumped up from her chair and said it was time to go home because big sister can't be outside for so long. The parents sitting with their daughters did not understand the younger one's impulse but had not been 2 hours since they've gone out for a walk. But yet he helped for XP up and let her away from the garden. When the girls reached the palace they heard shouts of an attack on the kingdom. Elinica reacted quickly, took her sister by the hand and ran to the prearranged place. The older one frighteningly asks the younger one about her parents, but the younger one says that they will be fine. It is according to the original novel, only the sister who was kidnapped was hurt. At this point, the princess chose a space in the wall into which she invites her sister. Elenko recalls that this loophole was discovered by Prozoni. Yoni shows her sister a small bulge in the floor, and says that when the imperial army enters, Zevia must press this bulge to slide down into the cellar. The younger princess confirmed her thoughts when she saw, but there wasn't enough room for two and told her crying sister not to go anywhere. The older one cries and asks the younger one to explain what's going on, but Atlantica thought of no time for that and said they would see each other soon, and just a few seconds later asked Azialia that she should only think about the not yet born Britain. Elinica closed the wall with the closet, making sure her sister was safe, and told her to watch what was going on through the gap. Elinica began to run across the street while hearing the strikes of swords and the shouts of warriors. The frightened girl hid behind the column, but she realized that things were much scarier than she had imagined. Elinica realized that in order for her to get to second loophole and hide, she would need to get into the Eastern Palace, but she didn't know what she to do at that exact minute, wait for surgery or run to that place. The girl was confident. Insert J. But unfortunately she realized too late that she had already ruined the consistency of the original story in her frustrated feelings. She quickly realized that in that case she should still run with all her might to another palace. Yeah, he looked around, realized no one was there, and ran on tiptoe to the next column. But what she didn't know was that at that moment, the Emperor himself noticed her as she ran by the princess round to the next pillar and looked out behind it. At that moment the gulf rose, for she saw the blood-colored eyes turned on her. She had sharply behind the column, but realized she had been spotted. She heard a man approaching her and began to mentally call out for Sergei. The moment their eyes met, her heart practically stopped with fear. The Emperor recognized her at once by her pink hair and eyes the color of the sky. And he, with the words that the princess of Above-Knee had fallen for him, began to reach out his hand to her, and she was finally convinced that he was the Emperor of Belga. Elinica fainted and woke up when someone carried her on their shoulder. The warriors of the kingdom of Above-Knee ran up, shouting for the Emperor to let the princess go. The fight began, but the advantage was clearly on the Emperor's side. At that moment Elinica realized that she was seasick. But she was still hanging on the man's shoulder and thought that although she had prevented her sister's kidnapping, she did not understand why she had been taken. Then so did ran up to the Emperor and Elinica. Elinica was very happy to see Sergei and told him that the Emperor was a terrible man, but the Emperor only pressed the princess tighter against his shoulder. The moment the ruler of Belgo thought Elinica began to cry, the girl asked the Emperor to put her on her feet. Because she was in pain from the way the owner was digging into her body, and besides she was seasick. There was no way that princess had expected the overload to put her on a horse. After that, she became really hysterical and started screaming about being afraid. The Emperor took her by the shoulder and began to calm her down. He then sat behind her back and asked her to straighten up. The ruler ordered his army to move back to Belgarth. The Lord conjured magic circle that transported and his army to the Empire of Belga for a quicker homecoming. The light coming from the circle was incredibly bright and the girl pressed herself against the Emperor and he covered her eyes with his hand. The Emperor gave orders to gallop without stopping until they would have set foot on the land of Delga. The girl didn't immediately realize what was happening, and when she opened her eyes they were blurry images in front of them. When the girl was fully awake, she began to consider the ruler. Lord of Radiant asked the halo what was wrong with the girl, and the healer replied that she needed to be thoroughly examined. The elder sat down to the girl and apologized for the ensuing fretfulness. As soon as the witch doctor activated some magical seal on his hand, first there was dizziness and afterwards Lennox's head was instantly pierced by a very strong pain and his body started twisting in different directions and she thought she was dying. She begged for someone to save her. Someone took a hand after that touch. The pain receded and the princess saw first defeat and handed the one who helped her. The frightened emperor immediately asked if the princess was all right. The princess tearfully replies that she is fine, she's still frightened and is still lying on the ground wondering what it is all about. The princess thinks about the fact that she spent the last few days exhausted trying to protect her sister and he has been kidnapped instead of her. Like some kind of shot. It was the first time she had ever ridden the horse, and also the first time she had experienced such a horrible pain in her head. With all that said, if she had known this was going to happen, she still would have chosen to do the same thing. The emperor turned to the girl, but she interrupted him and indignantly said if he couldn't capture her sister, he should have left instead of taking Elinica herself, and she ended her monologue by saying that he was bad. The emperor answered nothing and simply gently lifted the crying girl up, holding her in his arms. He asked why she was so sad. But she said nothing and only looked at him reproachfully. The girl couldn't predict the overload's next move, but he planted her on the imperial flag. The ruler crouched down on one knee and began wiping her tears, also saying that he didn't know she was so sensitive to mana. He apologized and asked if she was really in that much pain. The girl was dumbfounded at what was happening. Also, the overlord said that she seemed frightened by this sudden abduction. When it reached the girl that the emperor was wiping her tears, she snatched a handkerchief from his hands with the words that she could do it herself. The girl mentally asked yourself 2 questions about what that pain was and why it went away at that moment. You ready? And asked her to tell him she had always been so sensitive to magical stones. Elinica replied that she didn't know why that happened. The emperor was surprised that she didn't know. The princess said that it had never happened to. In fact, the girl in America's body only knew what happened in the last 8 months. The emperor turned to his healer, named Roselle, and asked what had happened. Roselle, frightened, began to explain that if the girl was more sensitive to mana than the average person, this reaction was not surprising. The emperor asked how she could not have known about it, and Roselle said that she grew up in an environment where she was never exposed to mana. Then it was possible the lord immediately asked the next question about why the princess was suddenly better, at which point the girl glared threateningly at the healer. Unfortunately, Roselle did not have an answer to this question, but he excitedly added that if they observe the princess, they might find answers. The ruler said that they could no longer use the magic circle anyway, and afterwards he announced that they had already crossed the border and could therefore continue to travel on horseback. The emperor asked Elinica if she was used to horses. The girl quickly replied that she knew how to ride a horse, but the emperor did not believe it, and said that she looked too frightened for a person who could easily move on a horse. The princess denied his suspicions and said it was just difficult for her to go alone. The governor said that in that case the girl would go with him. The governor gave his hand and told her to get up. Elinica constantly thinks he is too kind for a kidnapper since he's the father of the car who's become obsessed due to lack of love and care. The girl thought you ready and would be cruel. I'm cold, Atlantic. I wondered if she was not going to be sent back to above me. The ruler just looked at the girl without saying anything. The princess was on the verge of tears. She thought that no matter how kind he was. But in the original novel he had kept the Sevier imprisoned for 10 years. The ruler made the girl promise that if negotiations ended successfully, he would see to her safety. In that moment, Elinica thought about the fact that this man would be killed at 40 by sun. And that it was a unique thing in its own way, the feeling one gets when knowing the end of another person's life. The emperor asked the princess if he could count on her cooperation. The ruler heard no answer from the princess, and filled with the cooperation was impossible, for his words sounded more like a threat than an offer. The girl paid no attention to the emperor's words and reflected that she did not know his name, for it was not mentioned in the novel the princess addressed him with. Nickname Mr. Father, but she knew him only as a father of the villain. This address threw the emperor into a stupor, but she didn't let him wonderful long and immediately asked him what his name was. The emperor, looking at Elinica a little disconsolately, replied that his full name was if reading Lou's Soul Doorbell Garth. The princess said that the ruler probably already knew her name. She said it in its full form. Alana Kashu VL above me. The girl laughed at the situation and said that she was pleased to meet the ruler. The ruler, not ceasing to be surprised from this girl, said that he was also pleased. After a while, when the emperor's army advanced home, Elinica was very tense, sitting next to the emperor on horseback. The lord said that if the princess was constantly in such tension, a back and lower back were deck. But the girl said there was nothing of assault and she was in no pain at. Atlantica was very flattered when the European removed the armor so she wouldn't be in pain from the way it cut into her body, but she hadn't considered the point that their bodies were now very close together and she was confused to the point of embarrassment. The girl noticed that the man did not sweat at all. She feels better just from breathing in that clean and fresh scent. At one moment the unexpected happened abruptly and the princess almost fell off the horse on a pump, but the emperor reacted in time and managed to pick her up. The lord asked the princess to sit still. After a while the princess felt sick again. Rose will simply let the flames. But already even from those actions the girl had already suffered. But after the emperor touched Mikat again, she came to her senses. You really pulled the girl close to him and asked the healer as she was too sensitive. Roselle himself could not understand what was happening and said that he had not yet done anything but had only started the fire. The princess in her head started listing all 3 times. Have gotten really sick lately. The first time was the magic circle they have gone through. The second was when Rosa used magic to heal the wound did. The third was when the healer started a fire. The elderly healer concluded that the princess had intolerance to magic. Elinica realized that it was because she was just a newcomer to this dimension, that is. She was in Atlantic's body, but her mind was still so young, so from the normal world, the emperor has ordered that the use of magic be avoided. The princess wondered why, even when she was in so much pain that it felt like she was about to die, but just touching the emperor made her feel better. The overlord lifted the princess up and asked if it had never happened to her before. In above me yearly reflected that this was the first time she'd encountered magic since he got here 8 months ago. Due to the fact that lobotomy is a small kingdom, Eleni began to compare it to Belga. In Lubavni, magical stones are only used to protect the borders, while in Belgos there is a huge supply of these stones. Going to Belga, there were no court mages in above me. Only visitors, while in Belgium if there is a multi-level training system for mages and even has start mages who were outlawed. Lobotomy has no magical towers while Belgos has many. A learning curve is afraid that she has someone unprepared and from a country where magic is almost non-existent is being taken to a place where there is even an excess of that magic. Yani is desperate and thinks she is useless and compares herself to remove fish. Because in Korea that's what they call people who can't do anything and they are helpless. She also tells you read Ian that they better hit her with something. Social shut down and stay out of the way. The emperor, thinking he is misheard, asked the princess to repeat herself. The princess says that she had been hit on the head from behind and lost consciousness. Then they would have been able to get to the palace faster. The ruler, unsure, asks Elena go about whether she wanted to hurt her, but yet he clarifies that the pain would not last long and that she would wake up in bed afterwards. The lord said he found it unacceptable to raise a hand against a member of the royal family, much less a girl, and any car was both outraged and touched. But he was such a polite kidnapper. Cries were heard from outside of someone hurting their arm and someone hurting their leg. And Rosal said that without magic you can't make fire, cook food, or heal wounds. Elenica embarrassingly said that she could not and would not limit his majesty. The girl offered to use magic near her again to make her pass out, but the overlord hesitated and asked what to do in case things got out of hand. Yeah, he said that if things got bad, the emperor could ******** and she would feel much better. The lord said that it would be difficult, but he didn't want to shame the honor of his army. And said that warriors who were excellent with weapons would easily be able to do all these actions, even with minor wins, without the use of magic. The man threw his cloak over the girl and told her that he had made her a promise that he would keep us safe and that she didn't want to make the ruler of Bel go look like a man who didn't keep his word. Then they should stop talking. After that, he asked her not to go far away because the borders of Belgo surrounded by magical stones. The girl felt sadness, but she did not understand why such a man will be. The kidnapper would fall victim to dark magic and be killed by his own son. Yeah. He wiped away her tears and said that she would definitely save the emperor, calling him father again while doing so below. We didn't understand why she continued to address him that way, but she paid no attention to it and asked that he rely on her. The princess things are the Aaron Belgo of being heavier than in above knee because of the but when she is near him, she feels better and imagines that the man's body contains energy that acts on her like a magical cure. Here the girl reflected on the fact that there was no cure. Razzle, who was sitting a safe distance away from the princess, also shouted that there was no cure. Yet the healer said that people with man intolerance don't live longer than 5 years. But it seems to him that princess's case might be an exception. The words of the healer gave Eni a real shock. Eni appeared from behind the emperor's backing with a shout. She interrogated Razzle. The healer went on to say that no matter how hard a person tries to avoid mana, it is useless because mana is not in any particular place. Elenica looked at the elder in surprise and he said that the mina saturated both the ground and the air. The man said that was the norm for such unusual people to die from an overabundance of magic. But after just a few seconds he said that if the princess had lifted adult and then she would be fine, but Elenica, or rather soon so knew that this body had lived so long because the real Annika had been inside it before. The girl jumped up from the stump on which she was sitting. Before she realized that since she had already spent 9 months in this world, she had only 4 years and 3 months to live, the emperor called out to the princess. But she did not hear him. The lord realized that he was a bit out of it, and so he pulled her by the arm and sat back down, asking Roselle to keep telling her. The healer assumed that the divine essence within the emperor's body was protecting the princess from the mana that was harming her. Elenica began to recall that the original novel showed the history of the Belgrove family, and their connection to divine powers was detailed in a side story of Takob. The story tells that the imperial lineage of a sacred empire of Balgarth is blood related to rulers, the god of peace and prosperity. Roselle turned his majesty and said that his divine essence was by the princess aside, she would be fine. The physician also clarified that even if his majesty didn't use divine power is to always exuded it, and so perhaps that princess body was responding to that energy. Elenica became excited. This meant that the emperor's divine essence would be able to save her mortal body. The healer called out to Elenica and asked if the girl had ever received the blessing of the gold rulers. The girl did not understand Rose's question at first. The emperor phrased the question asked if the girl was that is. As soon as Villa found out that Brittany was pregnant, she immediately got a blessing for baby. Members of the royal family receive a blessing before and after birth. So Annika has one to see you on so did not know whether Atlantica had been baptized, for it was not mentioned in the story. The emperor asked her whether she was sure or not, but since she couldn't reveal all the details of her situation, she said she was definitely baptized. The Emperor hesitated at Yoni's answer, but since in this world is sinful to reveal 1 second that Tai's name, the girls simply nodded affirmatively. In this world, revealing once that Tai's name to anyone other than one's parents and spouse is considered a desecration of the name given by the gods. So also says that her favorite scene in the novel is when Alexia said his baptized name to Brittany. You really and says that of course Ilinica must be baptized, since above me is one of the countries under rules protection. Brazel says she does. For isn't the princess still safe and sound because she is always guided by God? Atlantica said that it wasn't the healer's fault for what happened because she understood that everything happened because of C1. So getting into that body. For summarize we can understand that Seal 1 so has a man and tolerance because she is from another world. But fortunately Olenic's body was blessed by God. So if the girl is near a bear of divine power she will negate the effects of man or Ilinica contemplates what plans to come up with next. The previous one was to save a sister from being kidnapped and it has succeeded. But it also failed because Ilinica herself was mistakenly kidnapped on top of that due to her mana intolerance. Yet he had turned into what she thought was a useless person. The girl reflects on the fact that who would have thought that a minor character doomed to a miserable death would be her savior? Ilinica began to think of 3 plan, which is to win the Emperor's favor. Since then he is in this situation, she won't be able to stay away from the overload for long since is basically her mana defense to prevent your region from being killed by sun. The Ka must not learn dark magic, the carbs and dark magic from his mother. To prevent the Emperor's son from learning dark magic. Iridium should not marry that one. Initially at this moment, Ilinica thought about the fact that the Overlord would be able to marry her at the moment of these musings. The Emperor called out to the girl, yet he concluded that her current plan was perfect. Before leaving for capital Anika, Saxon hypnotized the Emperor with her gaze. A girl thinks about how marrying a kind, gentle and handsome man is wonderful, but even if it's just a fantasy, she wants it to last forever. Iridian, smiling, asked the princess what she was thinking. Yeah, he replied that she was thinking about how handsome the Overlord was. And also about marrying him while calling him father again. The Emperor looked at her very surprised. Atlantica didn't understand why the Emperor was looking at her so strangely, but the events of the previous day began to flash through her mind and she realized that marriage was out of the question. You really, and said that Atlantica was a rather unusual girl. Yet he felt frustratedly that even if she spent her whole life, there would still be no reason for the Emperor of Elgar to marry a princess from a small country the size of a marigold. The Emperor after Lineker. To come up the Lord put the princess on a horse. When all the soldiers as well as the Emperor and the princess had mounted their horses, the Lord gave the order to move out so that they could be in the capital by evening. At this moment, yeah, he was thinking about our own thing, namely, that even if she couldn't marry you ready. And she still couldn't let the Emperor marry. Adopt which? Since in the novel Itikab is the fruit of the strongest divine energy and the darkest magic, Elinica ponders that Lady Aloud is out of her mind since she showed us on the world of black magic and think of ways to stop this wedding. The girl did not consider one point. She did not know when exactly the wedding should take place. Elinica knows that Brittany and Alexio are the same age as her and Takab is a year younger than them. At which point, yeah, he is horrified to realize. But she has only a year, by her wildest calculations, to solve the wedding problem. Any hardly dared to ask the ruler he was unmarried or if he didn't have a child, yet laughing like grinning replied that he was not married yet and accordingly he had no children and did not expect to have any. The princess was very disturbed by your audience saying goodbye. Well, the princess was thinking an army led by the emperor reached the capital of Belgium. Atlantica was very surprised to find that Belgium had an air of antiquity unlikely above knee, which has the image of a nice country. His Majesty threw his cloak over the princess so the crowd greeting the army would have no questions. The girl was afraid of such a huge crowd and wrapped herself more tightly in her plug. She was very grateful to Iridian, and realized that if she hadn't been wearing the cloak she would have been very embarrassed after the emperor and princess reached the cast every day and helpful in a cat down from horse. And the girl once again thought that the overload was the perfect husband. The girl thought sadly that there would be no marriage, but she would very much like to dream about it. In a moment of reflection a woman ran up to the princess and the emperor with words to the effect that she was very glad his majesty had returned safely and how worried she was about him. She was none other than Lady Alad. The lady said she missed the overlord very much. Atlantica blushing thought about the fact that Lady Elliot was incredibly beautiful and her voice was very melodious, as if she was bewitching people. The princess with slight envy, they've only been gone for 3 days, but Lady Elliot said with even more underlying hysteria, but for those 3 days were like 3 years. The emperor, with the same indifference, answered that he understood. Elenico wondered why the emperor was so calm and indifferent when such a beautiful woman was standing in front of him, and he did not even look interested the moment the princess was indignant about the ruler not reacting in any way to the lady's tears. She crossed her gaze and was discouraged by the way the lady looked at her. The emperor told solely Alad, but the trip posed no danger and asked if she had such a pressing need to come to the palace in person. Lady Elliot grinned and asked how his majesty could be so heartless, and afterward the lady asked the overseer why she could not come to the palace where she would in the future life. Besides, the lady said, it was the man who have returned who might be husband and who? But she should meet the possible future husband. The emperor agreed with the lady's words. At that moment an epiphany descended upon Elinica and she realized exactly who she had met. The princess thinks that this woman is Takab's mother, the empress of Belgos and wife of Eurydion, who is a dark witch who revised corpses and summoned souls from hell. Elinica remembered the emperor's words about the wedding. And how he had said that he was not married yet because he already had someone who was going to marry. And the princess thought of how she could compete with such a beautiful girl, so also win in this competition. The ruler rather coldly asked. Lady allowed to stop crying, but he had no handkerchief with him last week and also said that he thought it was best for Soli to go home. Elinica thought about the fact that although Soli allowed was the emperor's bride, but from the looks of it, his attitude towards that wasn't much different from how he acted with princess. Any fault with the side that if a beauty like Lady couldn't touch his heart, she certainly couldn't use him in her moment of reflection. Elenic, I didn't notice Celia's fearful gaze upon her. The princess felt dizzy and began to stumble. She felt as though she would go under and it felt like she was being pulled deeper and deeper into the ground. The emperor's warriors supported the princess to keep her from falling. Atlantica couldn't believe that this woman could have such power, Soli asked the emperor to make an appointment, for the princess continued. She felt to be pulled under the ground so hard that the warriors couldn't hold her back and called out to the ruler. Yoni began to choke, but the emperor managed to run up and by taking the girl by the shoulders, was able to relieve the spasm. At that moment Soli came up and said that although she did not know the girl, she thought she was possessed. And then she asked his majesty why he had brought a girl who was connected with the dead. Atlantica realized that Sola was trying to kill her with magic. The invisible hands of dead souls pulled the living into the underworld, was how the novel are described, the use of black magic. He looked at the witch tearfully, with a look of incomprehension and a mute question in her eyes as to what she had done to be treated like this. The emperor reproachfully told the lady that her words and actions and afterward complimented that earlier as a subject of the Belgian Empire should not dishonor her ruler. The lady made an innocent face and said that she was just worried about his majesty. Elenica looked at Solia indignantly, but the lady paid no attention to it, and after the emperor's words, apologized if I had offended her after that. So he said that if the princess wasn't feeling well and she didn't mind, the lady was willing to take care of her. As an apology, and Lenny almost went crazy at her insolence, the princess fell back on her back again. The emperor crouched down to help the girl up with words about not being able to relax for a moment with her. His majesty gently lifted the girl up as it turned out. Yeah, he lied about feeling sick at this point. The emperor thanked his army for their hard work and let them go to rest. The overlord said that Lady Elliot had better go, so they tried to stop the ruler. But he was adamant. Elenica looked at her judgmentally and folded about the fact that this particular dog, which in the novel was behind the emperor's assassination. The princess thought about the fact that there was no way she would let such a good man marry such a bad woman. Just the same, Yoni mentally asked the emperor to choose anyone but this, which, as his wife Elenico began to make faces at the ladies, a woman began to stand murderously at the girl the overlord was carrying away, but in an instant the girl saw that the iridium had noticed what she was doing. The ruler said whatever she was up to. All her actions were too obvious, but the girl didn't believe she was so predictable. Even though Suon Eso is now in a different body, she is still a person whose thoughts are displayed on her face. The emperor, looking closely, said that both times the princess pretended to feel ill. Yeah, he did not tell the emperor that the first time she real as the overlord carried her in his arms, told him that she was very afraid of Soliel Ad. Yoni stammered at the fact that she and you're ready and was so close to each other. The ruler tells us that Lady Elad is the second major, the tower. The first major was Senator's elder princess was surprised that the emperor knew that Sail was a witch. You really, and said it would be strange if he didn't know, but the power of Bel goes under the emperor's rule. Any thought Lady Allied was a dark mage and was hiding her abilities. Black magic is strictly forbidden on the continent of Roka. The magic of darkness steals the souls of the dead. It was supposed to return to God and turns the bodies of the dead into puppets. If someone is caught using black magic, the punishment is death. It is for this reason that black magic is studied in secret. Knowledge is passed from teacher to student. Elenica concluded that Lady Elad is a very powerful dark sorcerer and also that the emperor is unaware of her practicing the dark arts. The ruler said he would warn solely and not to use magic in the presence of Elenica. The ruler asked that she meet Lady Aloud as infrequently as possible, but she was used to using magic often. The sources contributed greatly to the improvement of the Tower of Belga. A magic is so strong that great strides have been made in the defense of the place. Thanks to her. Atletico reflected on the fact that she couldn't rely on luck because apparently the ruler trusted in Soli's abilities. The princess began to contemplate even telling the ruler. The fact that Lady Aloud is a dark witch and she will not stop even in the face of death. But the princess quickly realized that she couldn't just say it all, because then there would be questions about how she knew it. He decided to keep her mouth shut in front of Sophia because the princess is terrified of the woman. The lord said that Lady Elad would not appear in the palace without an invitation. Elenica thought about how cool the overlord was. Yeah. He also thought about the fact that he practically the witcher. At one point the girl began to look around and realized that the area seemed familiar to her about Bruce. The large windows, the ivory-colored curtains. This little castle reminded her over the bunny's castle. Elenica asked the emperor to let her go and she went to consider the surroundings and in an instant Zoo also realized exactly where she had seen such an encourage to. Zed was looking at the ball castle within. Thinking guys and having her large belly, the sight reminded to Zevia of our home country. Capital tears rolled down her cheeks for the Emperor of Belgrave organized all this was a moment in the story of the Palace of Belloc with Celia and Brittany lived in the original novel. The maids came out to meet Princess Abovni and greeted her. As Elinico walked past the girls, her gaze locked onto one of them. See you. Also remembered where she had seen this girl missed. Asialia, how are you doing today? After maid with light brown hair and brown eyes, the Harms carefully lifted the covenant eyed it neatly. The CV looked at her intently and replied that all was well. Marianne was the only maid who took care of his eviers. She said. She came from the south of the Bosnia. The princess called out to Marianne and the girl answered with a smile. Many felt strange because although it was her first meeting with the maid, she seemed very familiar. After meeting the maids, Elinica entered the castle. The princess thinks about the fact that as soon as she climbs the stairs, she will see the room where Tazevia and little Brittany lived. In the novella, the girl entered the room that filled with sunlight in the evening and where Brittany's life began. Elinica knows that this world is a novella, but for some reason it feels very strange to hear anything. She has this strange feeling about the fact that Asialia has been in this room for 10 years. At that moment the princess realized that she was definitely good for keeping her sister out of Belga. CEO1 so felt tired because from so many events in the last few days and being surrounded by magic for such a large amount of time, it was very hard for an untrained body. After the princess had looked around the room, the emperor came in to see her. He last if Atlantic. I like the room your idioms that he was curious about something. He asked the princess why she often called him father. He said she called him that because she associated him with her father. Naturally she lied to him. It just so happened that when Suon so I was reading the novel and you ready and died. She yelled father as she cried. The emperor says that the girl can't lie at all. Ellen Go on the other hand insists that she's telling the pure truth. The rulers that he hasn't married yet and he doesn't have children, so calling him father is rather rude. The overlord reprimanded the princess for this and she said she would not call him that again. You really? And said that America had come a long way. She needed to rest, and if she had any questions she could ask the maid. The lord specified that although it was rather rude to bring Princess Abovni to Belgard, she was no different from a guest of God. And so he told her not to hesitate to ask for whatever she wanted while she was in the empire and Lenin confirmed Beristan. Uncomfortable at the emperor's attentiveness, the princess thought the emperor was kind and nice to everyone. But after she saw his communication towards Solihal Ad, she changed her mind. Just as his majesty was about to leave the room, the princess stopped the man abruptly. She asked him if he was going to marry Lady Alad. The emperor replied that he is going to because Solia would be a good empress. Unfortunately, Elinica has no valid argument that Solia is an unsuitable ruler. However, no one will believe it if the princess says that Lady Elliot is a black mage. At this point, the princess's main goal is the emperor's trust. He should trust Elinica more than he trusts Salir. The emperor took the girl's hand gently and told her to be more careful. Atlantic, and noticed that she felt better after the touch. Yet he was embarrassed by such concern from the overload. You really and told the princess not to let anyone into her personal space, especially her room. Alanago was outraged that the ruler himself had just walked in on her. Afterward the emperor, after gently tidying the princess of her, told her if anyone entered her bedroom authorized she should immediately kick him out. And in the third he supplemented that if a man leaves on his own majesty should not keep him as the overload turned around to leave, yet he said words to his back about suddenly liking him. Elinika thinks about this being her chance to find out where his majesty drew the line and how far the princess can go, how much she can provoke this man to win against. Lady allowed anything about the fact that she doesn't have many advantages that she can use to benefit the Belgos empire. Still she does have something she has to offer and that is beauty. The princess thought she should have said the words of sympathy in a sweeter and more shy voice. The lord, sighing heavily, thought about what he should do with this girl. But the emperor told Elinika the fourth condition, and it was that the girl should not say such words for anyone, never and under any conditions. And he added that the princess should not try to deceive him, for the lord is quite shrewd. C. Alonso reflected on the fact that his Majesty had no idea how evil a woman he trusted, but Elinika told the man that she absolutely did not see her as a woman. Euridion replied that he perfectly well saw the princess as a woman, but that fact in no way justified her careless actions. Lastly, His Majesty said that the girl did not know what the consequences of this or that rush action of the princess might be. The girl was furious that the emperor had hinted to her that her seduction techniques would not welcome him now. The princess would have to get serious about seducing the lord the moment the ruler left. He felt the back of his neck practically burning from Elinika's gaze. Euridion thought about how amazing the goal was. After all, she looked nice, and though she might not seem like anything special at first glance, she had an incredibly strong presence. The emperor reflected on the fact that he had never intended to harm the princess they would take hostage. The marginal above knee had not originally been organized to cause carnage. It was merely a warning for the Lebanese insolent behavior and their attempts at excessive profiteering from the stone crossing. As Lord of Belgos, Iridium was obliged to make such a bold statement. He had deliberately selected his best soldiers and divided them into small groups, instructing them to make every effort to avoid deaths. Even this morning, it was now only a matter of time before above me opened the way to the ruler experienced the feeling that they had taken someone very troubled. You ready and can't get rid of the thought that they stole the princess who let Caffrey life and you no grief. And so he feels guilty. In a moment of reflection the lord entered his office and so one of his warriors, the guard, reported that he and the rest of the army had carried out the ruler's orders and collected all items that contained magic within a 200-meter radius of the Blue Palace. The lord wondered if such a little later, the ruler ordered the radius to be increased to 500 meters. The warrior tried to explain to you, Redian, but if the radius was increased then the main palace would be included in the list. The ruler said to do his bidding anyway. The Euridian reflected on the fact that he had promised the princess safety and so it was better to be reassured. At that moment, the warrior said he would do as a ruler ordered. The guard reflected on the fact that in his normal state, the emperor would not have gone to such lengths and that was all because the prisoner was a person of high birth. The lord thought about why he was acting this way and came to the conclusion that was because a legacy is nice to him. Nor does the Euridian thing. She was pretending to be in front of Lady Alad. The ruler realized that he was attracted to the girl because she reminded him of a kitten who knew nothing about the world. Before the guard left, the emperor addressed him again by the name and told him to tell Solly a lot that she could no longer appear in the palace. The warrior was shocked at what he heard at this moment. The overlord said that it seemed like he'd been too lenient on the lady after all she appeared in the imperial palace whenever she wanted, without even asking permission. Felix said that he didn't think Lady Alad would take the news well cause the woman had previously turned absolutely all women away from the union previously. The overlord never hindered Soliel ADD because she drove away aristocrats who got in his way. But now when he needs to protect someone, he can't let her leave and come whenever she wants. Whatever the princess is thinking, all her thoughts and emotions are displayed on her face. The emperor said he was entrusting the matter to Flick and the warrior obeyed. Eleniko woke up after sleeping for almost 24 hours because she was very tired, but at the same time, the princess does not feel rested. The girl is sure that she feels better. After the emperor touched her yesterday before leaving, Marion came in and asked if she had been told correctly that the princess needed special care because of her sensitivity to magic. Her highness confirmed that she had a sensitivity to magic, but she reassured that maid that everything was fine. Marion looked at the princess very concerned. Lee and Linacre thought of the maid looking at her. I said she had nothing left to live for and that was why she was trying to keep a smile in her last days. The princess tried to say that Marion had nothing to worry about but the maid literally shouted that for the sake of the princess the emperor's subjects had gotten rid of all magic items. Invalid Palace Marion also added that magic items were also removed within a 500-meter radius of the palace. Elinica could not understand what the 500 this meant but yet he was not familiar with the geography of the imperial palace and Marianne, noticing the emotion on the girl's face, suggested that she go out and look around. Also the maid warned that the boundaries where there was no magic were marked out. Elinica realized that until the conflict between the countries was resolved she would be in the empire and so she had better familiarize yourself with the palace. Yeah, he was happy at the suggestion and said she would definitely go for a walk. When the girls went outside, Elinica could see the very boundaries that Marion was talking about. Also, Elinica saw a beautiful and large garden. In the east, the border runs along the central imperial garden. In the west it runs along the end of the path at the Chiapa Palace. The southern border ends at the training hall and the northern one is at the northern gate of the imperial palace. These are the places that are within 500 meters of the Blue Palace. Marion says that it is within these boundaries that the princess can safely walk but align. Ego thinks about the fact that even though Marion has warned her, but still the princess cannot know where and when the mana stones will be used. Eni is treated much better than normal prisoners, but she is still limited in her actions, but soon, so can't complain because it's all because of her new body. But to be honest, Elinica doesn't even have anywhere to go outside the palace. Marion said that the emperor had given orders to the princess to inform him as she went outside the palace. Eni rejoiced at the news that she and you read. Ian would be meeting in person at the same moment Elinica asked Marianne to go abroad, but as soon as the princess turned around, she saw a man who said she was under His Majesty's orders to score the goal wherever she wanted to go. Eni asked who he was, and the man introduced himself as Derrico. Shumar eats the priest of Row List Hour. Elinica was angry at Euredian for putting a tower priest on her, and she wondered if it wasn't a tacit sign that the man wouldn't see her in person. Dirigo said that he was not as strong as His Majesty, so it will take some time before he could summon the divine spirit, and he asked the princess to tell him at once she felt even the slightest sign of weakness.